Have you ever looked at the world around you and wondered what it really is? Not just how things work, but why they exist at all. Imagine for a moment, what if reality is nothing like what you think it is? What if everything you believe about existence, consciousness, and the universe is just scratching the surface of something far more profound? Today we're diving into the deepest questions humans have ever asked. Questions that science alone can't answer. Questions that will completely transform how you see everything. Welcome to the mind-bending world of metaphysics, where we don't just study reality, we question the very nature of existence itself. What is metaphysics? The ultimate reality check. Metaphysics isn't as complicated as it sounds. At its core, it's simply the study of reality itself, the most fundamental questions about existence. While physics explains how things happen through equations and experiments, metaphysics asks the deeper what questions. What is existence itself? What is reality made of at its most fundamental level? Why does anything exist at all rather than nothing? This fascinating field began with the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. Interestingly, the word metaphysics originally just meant after physics, because Aristotle wrote about these ideas right after he wrote about physical things like motion and matter. But over time, the term evolved into something much deeper: philosophy's ambitious attempt to understand the ultimate nature of reality. Metaphysics covers two main territories that will completely transform how you see the world around you. Ontology, mapping the territory of reality. The first major branch of metaphysics is called ontology, which tries to classify everything that exists. Ontologists explore whether abstract ideas like beauty, goodness, or numbers are real things or just concepts we create in our minds. For example, does the idea of redness exist by itself, or is it only real because we see red objects? This might sound abstract, but these questions shape how we understand everything around us. Ontology isn't just asking what things are made of, it asks what kinds of things can exist at all. Is everything in the world made up of physical objects, or are abstract things like ideas and emotions also part of reality? Think about it this way: a rock, a tree, your phone, these all seem obviously real. But what about things like time, love, or the number 7? Do they exist in the same way? These are the questions ontology explores. A key debate in ontology is between particulars and universals. Particulars are individual things, your specific cat or this specific chair. Universals are general qualities that many things can share, like redness or softness. Ontologists debate whether universals are real things that exist independently or just useful labels we attach to objects. Ontology also tackles questions about identity and persistence. If you replace all the parts of a ship one by one, is it still the same ship? That's not just a puzzle. It's an ontological issue about how things maintain their identity through change. In our modern world, ontology has practical applications too. In computer science and AI, an ontology is a structured framework used to represent knowledge. It helps systems understand how different pieces of data relate to each other. At its core, ontology is about building a map of reality. It helps us sort the world into categories that make sense, even when things aren't as straightforward as they first seem. And in doing that, it quietly shapes how we think about everything that exists. The second branch, exploring existence and consciousness. The second major area of metaphysics deals with more personal, relatable questions about existence. Things like the nature of our minds and consciousness, whether we have free will, and if anything exists beyond the physical world. These aren't just abstract philosophical puzzles. They're questions that touch the core of what it means to be human. When you make a choice, is that truly your decision, or was it predetermined by causes outside your control? When you have a thought or feeling, what exactly is happening? Is your mind just your brain or something more? Even though metaphysics doesn't always offer concrete answers like science does, it pushes our understanding deeper. It reminds us that behind everyday life is an incredible mystery, existence itself. And that's what makes metaphysics so fascinating. It doesn't require you to be a philosopher. It simply invites you to look a little closer at the reality around you. Arche, the origin of everything. Arche is a concept from ancient Greek philosophy that tries to identify the fundamental substance or principle that everything else comes from. Think of it like this. If the universe were a building, Arche would be the raw material it was made from, the bricks, beams, and foundation. Different early philosophers had different ideas about what this first substance could be. Thales, one of the earliest thinkers, believed everything came from water, not because everything's wet, but because he saw water everywhere, rivers, rain, even in our bodies. To him, it made sense as a unifying ingredient. Others disagreed. Anaximenes said it was air. Heraclitus went with fire. And Anaximander argued it wasn't any known substance, but something more abstract, an infinite formless source he called the apeiron. These weren't just random guesses. They were sophisticated attempts to explain the entire universe using logic and observation, long before modern science existed. In fact, these early ideas eventually laid the groundwork for physics and cosmology. The concept of Arche was a way of saying, let's find the root of reality, not through stories or myths, but by thinking deeply. Even now, scientists and philosophers are still asking versions of the same question. What is everything made of? Where did it all start? Arche may be an ancient idea, but it points to something timeless, the drive to understand the very beginning of everything we know. Monism, everything is one. Monism offers one of the most radical perspectives on reality you'll ever encounter. While most of us see the world as a collection of separate things, people, animals, buildings, objects, monism flips this view completely on its head. Monism comes from the Greek word for single. In philosophy, it's the belief that all of reality, everything you see, feel, and think, is made of just one fundamental substance or principle. That might sound abstract, but it's actually quite simple at its core. Instead of thinking there's mind and matter or body and soul, monism says, no, it's all just one thing appearing in different forms. There are different kinds of monism. Some versions say everything is physical, what we'd call material monism. Others claim everything is mental, like one giant consciousness. This is known as idealist monism. And then there's neutral monism, which says the universe isn't mental or physical. It's something else entirely, something more basic that gives rise to both. To get a feel for monism, imagine a wave in the ocean. You can point to a wave and say it's a thing, but it's still just ocean-shaped differently for a moment. That's the monist view of you, me, everything. We're not separate things, just temporary patterns in a single endless whole. This idea isn't just a thought experiment. It has shaped entire cultures, from Eastern philosophies like Advaita Vedanta to modern physics debates about the fabric of reality. It challenges how we see ourselves and what we think the world really is. Monism doesn't ask you to stop seeing differences. It invites you to look deeper and notice what might be hiding underneath all of them. Unity, dualism, mind and matter. Dualism presents a completely different perspective than monism. It's the idea that reality is made up of two fundamentally different kinds of stuff, physical and mental, the body and the mind, the brain and the consciousness. According to dualism, your thoughts, memories, and emotions aren't just brain chemistry. They belong to a separate, non-material mind. The most famous version of this idea comes from 17th century philosopher René Descartes. He argued that the body is like a machine made of matter, operating under physical laws, while the mind is something else entirely, invisible, indivisible, and capable of thought. In Descartes' view, the mind and body interact but aren't the same thing. To make that clearer, think of a driver and a car. The car moves, accelerates, and stops. But it doesn't make decisions. That's the driver's job. In dualism, the body is like the car and the mind is the driver. But dualism raises tough questions. If the mind is non-physical, how does it control the body? How does an immaterial thought cause a hand to move? That puzzle, called the mind-body problem, has challenged philosophers for centuries. Even today, dualist ideas show up in everyday thinking. We talk about bodies and souls, or say someone is trapped in their mind. And despite advances in neuroscience, the question of whether the mind is just the brain or something more remains open. Dualism doesn't try to explain everything. It simply starts with a basic observation that resonates with many people's intuition. The mental and the physical feel different. From there, it builds one of the most enduring theories in philosophy. Idealism. Mind creates matter. Idealism presents one of the most mind-bending perspectives on reality you'll ever encounter. When you close your eyes, the world seems to disappear. But what if it actually does? Idealism is the theory that reality is fundamentally mental. In other words, everything we call real, objects, space, even time, is actually built from ideas or experiences in the mind. According to idealists, the physical world doesn't exist independently of perception. It only exists because it's being observed, thought about, or experienced. One of the most famous versions of this idea comes from George Berkeley, an 18th century philosopher. He argued that what we call matter doesn't exist on its own. For example, a tree isn't a physical object sitting out there waiting to be seen. Instead, the tree exists because it's being perceived by you, by others, or by some higher mind. To Berkeley, to be is to be perceived. This sounds counterintuitive. After all, we think of the world as something solid and independent. But idealism challenges that assumption. Think about a dream. While you're in it, it feels real. The people, places, and events all seem to have shape and space, but none of it exists outside your mind. Idealists suggest that waking life might be similar, just more consistent and shared. There are different forms of idealism. Some say everything is made of consciousness. Others argue that reality is shaped by the structures of thought itself, like a built-in lens our minds use to interpret the world. What they all share is the belief that the mind isn't just part of reality, it's the foundation of it. Idealism challenges how we define what's real. It flips the usual perspective, suggesting that ideas aren't floating above the material world. They are the material world. Materialism. Everything is physical. Materialism offers a stark contrast to idealism. The phone in your hand, the thoughts in your head, even the emotions you feel, according to materialism, they're all made of the same thing: matter. Materialism is the philosophical idea that everything that exists is physical. That includes obvious objects like tables and trees, but also things we usually think of as non-physical, like consciousness, memories, and imagination. Under materialism, these aren't separate from the body. They're the result of physical processes, especially in the brain. This idea traces back to ancient thinkers like Democritus, who believed everything was made of tiny particles, what we now call atoms. But materialism really took off with the rise of modern science. As physics, chemistry, and biology explained more about how the world works, materialism offered a powerful framework. If it can be measured, observed, or caused by physical forces, it's real. In a materialist view, your mind is not a mysterious force floating above your body. It's what your brain does when it processes information. Just like a computer runs programs using electrical circuits, your thoughts and feelings emerge from neurons firing and chemicals interacting. Of course, materialism faces challenges. One big question is consciousness. How can a lump of gray matter produce thoughts, sensations, and awareness? Some argue materialism hasn't yet explained this fully. Others believe it's just a matter of time and better science. Materialism has shaped much of modern science and technology. It's the basis for neuroscience, psychology, and even artificial intelligence. If everything can be explained in physical terms, it means we can study, predict, and maybe even replicate the mind itself. At its core, materialism is a simple idea with massive implications. The universe runs on physical laws, and everything we are, including the parts that feel most personal, follows those same laws. Atomism, the building blocks of reality. Atomism is one of the oldest philosophical theories about the nature of reality, and it's had an incredible impact on how we understand the world. Everything around you, your phone, the air, your body, even light, is made up of tiny pieces too small to see. That basic idea sits at the heart of atomism. Atomism is the belief that everything in the universe is made of tiny, indivisible units called atoms. These atoms aren't the same as the ones in modern chemistry. The concept goes back over 2,000 years to ancient Greece. Philosophers like Leucippus and Democritus proposed that the world isn't continuous or smooth, but built from countless small particles moving through empty space. According to classical atomism, atoms are eternal, solid, and unchangeable. They differ in shape and size, and their combinations create everything we see, rocks, plants, animals, even fire and water. Change doesn't come from anything disappearing or appearing out of nowhere. It's simply atoms rearranging into new forms. This view was radical for its time. It rejected ideas based on mythology or mysterious forces. Atomists believed the universe operated by natural laws, not the whims of gods. They were early champions of a mechanical, law-governed cosmos, a mindset that would later influence science during the Enlightenment. What makes atomism important isn't just the idea of tiny particles. It's the shift in thinking it represents. Atomism was one of the first attempts to explain the world using reason, logic, and observation rather than stories or tradition. Modern physics has advanced far beyond ancient atomism. Atoms as we know them today are made of even smaller parts. But the core insight, that complex things can be broken down into simpler components, remains a foundation of how we understand the physical world. Atomism was philosophy's first serious step towards science, a revolutionary way of viewing reality that continues to influence our understanding today. Pluralism. Reality is complex. Pluralism offers an important counterpoint to theories that try to reduce everything to one principle. Not everything can be explained by one single idea. Sometimes reality is just too complex for that. That's the starting point of pluralism in philosophy. Pluralism is the view that reality isn't made of just one kind of thing or reducible to a single principle. Instead, it's made of many kinds of things, each with its own nature and importance. It stands in contrast to monism, which says everything comes from one fundamental source like matter or mind. Pluralism says, no, that's too simple. The world is made up of many layers and they all matter. The idea can be traced back to ancient philosophers like Empedocles, who argued that everything was made not from one basic element, but from four: earth, air, fire, and water. Fast forward to modern philosophy, and pluralism is still around, just in more developed forms. Pluralists believe that reducing everything to just one substance or explanation, whether physical atoms, mental experiences, or anything else, misses how diverse and rich reality actually is. For example, you can't fully explain a painting by just talking about the paint. You also need psychology, culture, intention, emotion. Each offers a valid piece of the puzzle, and together they give a fuller picture. In ethics, political theory, and science, pluralism shows up as a kind of built-in flexibility. It says there can be multiple valid systems, values, or perspectives, not because everything is subjective, but because the world itself is complex enough to support more than one truth at a time. Philosophical pluralism reminds us that we don't have to choose just one lens to understand reality. Sometimes, multiple answers can all be right, each one unlocking a different side of the same complicated world. Realism. The world exists independently. Realism addresses one of the most fundamental questions in philosophy. Does the world exist independently of our minds? A tree falls in a forest. No one hears it. According to realism, it still fell, and it's still there. Realism is the philosophical idea that the world exists independently of our thoughts, perceptions, or beliefs. In simple terms, things don't need us to notice them to be real. Whether or not someone is around to observe a mountain, a planet, or a pile of sand, those things still exist just as they are. This might sound like common sense, but not all philosophical views agree. Some theories suggest that reality is shaped by our minds or experiences. Realism pushes back, claiming that facts about the world are objective. They don't shift based on who's looking or how they feel. There are different versions of realism depending on the topic. In metaphysics, realism says that physical objects exist outside of our awareness. In science, it holds that theories describe real things, like electrons or gravitational waves, even if we can't observe them directly. In ethics, moral realism argues that some actions are truly right or wrong, no matter what society thinks. One of the big debates in realism involves abstract concepts. For example, take the number 7. You can't touch it or see it like a rock, but it's used in math, physics, and engineering every day. So the question is, does 7 exist in some real way, or is it just a useful mental tool? Realists often say it exists, even if not in a physical form. What makes realism powerful is its steady confidence that reality is out there, structured, discoverable, and not entirely up to us. It's a foundation for science, logic, and most of the ways we try to understand the world. Epistemology. How do we know what we know? Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that studies knowledge, what it is, how we get it, and how we can be sure we actually have it. It's a fascinating field because most of what you believe, you didn't discover for yourself. You heard it, read it, or were told and decided it was probably true. But how do you know it's true? That's where epistemology comes in. Start with the basics. To say you know something, three things usually need to be true. First, the belief has to be correct. Second, you have to believe it. And third, you need a good reason for believing it. That last part, justification, is what separates knowledge from a lucky guess. Imagine someone randomly picks a lottery number and wins. They guessed right, but they didn't really know. In contrast, if a meteorologist uses weather data to predict rain tomorrow, and it does rain, that's closer to knowledge. It's not just a guess, it's a belief backed by evidence. Epistemology also explores where knowledge comes from. Some philosophers argue that we're born with certain truths already built in. Others say all knowledge comes from experience. Then there are questions about memory, perception, and even language, since most of what we know is passed down from others. The field also tackles skepticism. How can we trust what our senses tell us when illusions and false memories exist? And how do we know that the world outside our mind actually matches how we experience it? Epistemology doesn't always offer easy answers, but it lays the groundwork for understanding what counts as a reliable belief. In a world full of information, misinformation, and uncertainty, that kind of clarity is more important than ever. Skepticism. Questioning what we know. Skepticism challenges our most basic assumptions about knowledge. You see the sun rise, your feet touch the floor, and the news tells you what's happening in the world. It all feels certain, but skepticism asks a blunt question. How do you actually know any of it is real? In philosophy, skepticism is the view that we should doubt or suspend judgment about what we think we know. It doesn't claim that nothing is true. It just challenges the idea that we can be completely sure of anything, especially when our knowledge depends on perception, memory, or testimony. One of the earliest skeptics, Pyrrho of Elis, believed that because our senses can deceive us, we should withhold belief. If things can look different from different angles or under different conditions, how can we trust any single experience? Take a basic example. You put a straight stick in water and it looks bent. Your eyes tell you one thing, but your reasoning tells you another. Skeptics use cases like this to show that perception isn't always reliable, and if we can't fully trust our senses, then anything built on them, like science, history, or even daily experience, becomes less certain. Modern skepticism goes even further. Some versions ask how we know we're not dreaming or trapped in a computer simulation. Others point out that even our logical reasoning could be flawed, since it depends on assumptions that can't be proven without using reasoning itself. Still, skepticism isn't about giving up on knowledge. It's about setting a high standard for what counts as knowing. It pushes philosophy to be more careful, more precise, and more honest about the limits of what we can claim. In that sense, skepticism isn't the enemy of truth, it's a tool for testing it. Or rationalism, knowledge through reason. Rationalism centers on the power of human reason to discover truth. You don't need to see a triangle to know it has three sides. Some things we just seem to know by thinking. That's the starting point of rationalism. Rationalism is the philosophical view that reason is the primary source of knowledge. It claims that certain truths can be known independently of experience, just by using logic, thought, and deduction. In other words, not everything we know comes from the senses. This idea stands in contrast to empiricism, which says that knowledge comes mainly from observation and experience. Rationalists argue that, while experience is useful, it isn't the foundation of all knowledge. Mathematical truths like 2 + 2 = 4 are examples of knowledge you can grasp through reasoning alone. Rationalist thinkers believe that the mind contains certain basic ideas or structures from birth. These are often called innate ideas. Examples include concepts like quantity, identity, or even cause and effect. You don't learn them from the outside world. They're already built into how you think. One of the most famous rationalists, René Descartes, used pure reasoning to try to establish certainty. He started by doubting everything, including his senses, and worked his way up using logical steps. The idea was that reason could build a solid foundation for knowledge, even when experience might be misleading. Rationalism has had a huge influence on science, mathematics, and philosophy. It supports the idea that the mind is not just a passive receiver of information, but an active tool for discovering truth. By relying on reason, rationalism helps explain how we understand things that go beyond immediate experience, things that are abstract, universal, and often essential to how we make sense of the world. Empiricism, knowledge through experience. Empiricism stands as a direct challenge to rationalism, placing experience at the heart of knowledge. You know fire is hot because you felt it. You know sugar is sweet because you've tasted it. These aren't ideas you were born with. They came from experience. That's the core idea behind empiricism. Empiricism is the philosophical view that all knowledge comes from sensory experience. It says we're not born knowing things. We start with a blank slate, and everything we learn comes from what we see, hear, touch, taste, and smell. This idea directly challenges rationalism, which claims that some knowledge is built into the mind. Empiricists push back, arguing that without experience, even the most basic concepts wouldn't exist. You don't know what cold is until you've felt it. You don't understand blue unless you've seen it. The roots of empiricism go back to thinkers like John Locke, who described the mind at birth as a blank sheet of paper. For Locke, experience writes on that paper over time through direct observation and reflection. Later, philosophers like George Berkeley and David Hume developed the idea further, showing how everything from complex ideas to moral beliefs could be traced back to experience. Empiricism also laid the foundation for the modern scientific method. Instead of relying on pure logic or intuition, scientists observe, measure, and test. They build knowledge by gathering data and repeating experiments. That method reflects the core belief of empiricism, that truth starts with what we can observe. Of course, empiricism isn't just about science. It shapes how we think about learning, memory, perception, and even how we trust information. By grounding knowledge in experience, empiricism builds a framework for understanding the world through the evidence it gives us, one sense at a time. Solipsism. Is it all in your mind? Solipsism presents one of the most radical and unsettling perspectives in all of philosophy. Everything you've ever seen, heard, touched, or thought about has passed through your mind. So what if none of it exists outside your own head? Solipsism is the philosophical position that only your own mind is certain to exist. Everything else, other people, the outside world, even your own body, might just be part of your consciousness. Not because you're imagining it on purpose, but because there's no way to prove that anything beyond your thoughts is real. The reasoning starts with a simple fact. All your experiences come through your own perspective. You don't have direct access to other people's thoughts or sensations. You see someone smile, but you can't feel what they feel. You hear a sound, but it's always processed by your own senses. From this viewpoint, the world could be a kind of mental simulation, something your mind creates moment by moment. Solipsism isn't saying that everyone else is fake or that the world definitely isn't real. It's just pointing out that we have no way to be absolutely sure. Every bit of evidence you could use to prove otherwise, sight, sound, logic, still comes from within your own mind. It's like trying to step outside of your own shadow. This idea is more than just a thought experiment. It connects to deeper questions in epistemology and consciousness studies. Philosophers use solipsism to explore the limits of knowledge and how we define what's real. It also highlights a central challenge in philosophy, figuring out how we can know anything beyond our own experience. Even though few people actually believe in solipsism, the idea itself forces philosophy to be more careful about its assumptions. It reminds us that the line between certainty and belief is thinner than it looks. Pragmatism. Truth is what works. Pragmatism offers a refreshingly practical approach to truth and knowledge. If an idea works in real life, then maybe that's all the truth it needs. That's the core idea behind pragmatism. Pragmatism is a school of philosophy that focuses on the practical consequences of beliefs. Instead of asking whether something is abstractly true, pragmatists ask whether it's useful. If a belief helps you solve problems, make predictions, or get through life more effectively, then it has value, and that might be enough to count as knowledge. This approach was developed in the late 1800s by American philosophers like Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. They weren't interested in truth as something fixed and eternal. Instead, they saw it as something that could evolve depending on how well it holds up in real situations. In pragmatism, a belief is like a tool. Take the idea that germs cause disease. That belief is accepted not because it sounds elegant or fits a grand theory, but because it leads to effective treatments, vaccines, and healthier lives. The belief is considered true because it works. Pragmatism also applies to moral and social issues. For example, rather than debating whether justice has a perfect definition, a pragmatist might ask which policies or actions lead to a more fair and stable society. The focus stays on results, not idealized concepts. One of the key strengths of pragmatism is flexibility. It doesn't demand that ideas be perfect, just useful enough to make a difference. And if they stop working, pragmatism has no problem letting them go. By measuring truth through outcomes, pragmatism blends philosophy with real-world thinking. It treats ideas less like sacred answers and more like strategies, tools we test, refine, and keep using only as long as they help us navigate the world. Phenomenalism, reality as possibility of experience. Phenomenalism changes how we think about the existence of objects. When you leave a room, do the objects inside still exist? Phenomenalism says that's not the right question, because things don't exist independently of experience. They exist as possibilities of perception. Phenomenalism is a philosophical view that connects the existence of physical objects directly to sensory experience. According to this idea, to say that something exists is really just to say that it could be experienced under the right conditions. If no one is experiencing it, its existence still depends on how it would appear if someone were there to observe it. For example, imagine a book sitting on a shelf. Even if no one is in the room, phenomenalism holds that the book still exists, because if someone were to walk in, they would see it, touch it, or even hear it fall. Its reality is defined by the experiences it could produce, not by something separate or hidden behind them. This idea gained traction in the 19th and 20th centuries, especially among philosophers trying to make sense of how we talk about things we aren't currently sensing. Phenomenalism avoids saying objects have a mysterious existence out there. Instead, it treats talk about objects as shorthand for patterns of potential experiences. One advantage of phenomenalism is that it avoids some of the problems raised by skepticism. Since it doesn't rely on a world beyond experience, it doesn't need to prove that world exists. Everything meaningful is grounded in what can be observed, or at least what could be observed. Phenomenalism reshapes how we think about reality. It doesn't deny the world, it just shifts the focus from invisible matter to observable moments, turning physical objects into bundles of sensory possibilities rather than independent things. Coherentism, knowledge as a web of beliefs. Coherentism offers a unique solution to the problem of justification. Most people think a belief is justified if it rests on solid evidence. But what if there's no ultimate starting point, just a web of beliefs supporting each other? That's the idea behind coherentism. Coherentism is a theory in epistemology that suggests beliefs are justified not because they rest on a single foundational truth, but because they fit together in a consistent and logical system. In other words, a belief is reasonable if it makes sense within the bigger picture of everything else you believe. Think of it like a puzzle. One piece doesn't prove the picture is right, but if all the pieces connect and form a clear image, you trust the result. In coherentism, knowledge works the same way. Individual beliefs gain strength by how well they mesh with the rest of the system. This view stands in contrast to foundationalism, which says knowledge should rest on a firm base of self-evident truths or direct experiences. Coherentists argue that no belief stands completely alone. Even things we take for granted, like what we see or remember, are interpreted through our background beliefs. A simple example might help. Suppose you believe your friend is at home because their lights are on, their car is in the driveway, and they said they'd be home earlier. Each of those observations supports the idea, but none of them prove it on their own. The belief becomes stronger because all the details fit together. Coherentism doesn't guarantee absolute certainty, but that's not the goal. Instead, it focuses on building a network of beliefs that reinforce each other, like a well-balanced structure. The more tightly connected and internally consistent your beliefs are, the more justified they become, at least within that system. Foundationalism, building on solid ground. Foundationalism takes a completely different approach to knowledge than coherentism. When building a house, you start with a foundation. Without it, everything else risks collapsing. Foundationalism applies that same idea to knowledge. Foundationalism is a theory in epistemology that says all of our beliefs are built on a base of basic, self-justified beliefs. These foundational beliefs don't rely on other beliefs to be considered valid. They're seen as secure starting points. From there, more complex beliefs are built on top, layer by layer. The structure is often imagined like a pyramid. At the bottom are beliefs that are considered obvious or undeniable, things like I exist or I'm in pain. These are beliefs you can hold without needing further proof. On top of those, you build beliefs about the world, science, history, and everything else. This idea became especially important during the rise of modern philosophy. Thinkers like René Descartes were searching for certainty. Descartes famously doubted everything he could until he arrived at one belief he thought couldn't be doubted: that he was thinking. That, he believed, was a foundation strong enough to build upon. In foundationalism, justification moves upward. Higher-level beliefs, like the idea that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, are supported by more basic ones, like sensory observations and logical reasoning. The goal is to avoid circular reasoning, where beliefs only support each other without any secure base. Critics argue that finding truly foundational beliefs is harder than it sounds. What feels obvious to one person might not be obvious to another. Still, foundationalism has been influential in shaping how we understand knowledge and certainty. At its core, foundationalism is an attempt to ground human understanding on something firm, starting with beliefs that can stand on their own and using them to support everything else we claim to know. Constructivism, building reality through experience. Constructivism challenges the idea that knowledge is something we discover, suggesting instead that it's something we create. No one is born knowing what a country is, what money means, or how traffic lights work. These things aren't found in nature. They're built by people. That's the basic idea behind constructivism. Constructivism is the philosophical view that knowledge and meaning are not simply discovered. They're constructed. According to this idea, we don't just passively absorb facts from the world. Instead, we actively shape what we know based on our experiences, social interactions, and cultural background. At its core, constructivism focuses on how human beings create frameworks for understanding reality. For example, the concept of time isn't experienced the same way across all cultures. Some treat it as linear, others as circular. The way we talk about time, measure it, or even feel it is shaped by the systems we live in, not something hardwired into our minds. In education, constructivism has had a major impact. Rather than seeing students as empty containers to be filled with information, this approach sees them as participants who build understanding through exploration and context. Learning isn't just about memorizing facts. It's about making connections based on what someone already knows. In science and ethics, constructivism pushes the idea that what we accept as truth or morality is often shaped by history, language, or shared beliefs. Even scientific models are not perfect mirrors of reality. They're tools we've built to make sense of it. Constructivism doesn't mean anything goes. It still values evidence and logic. But it reminds us that human understanding is always filtered through a lens shaped by how we think, communicate, and live. By emphasizing the role of the human mind in creating meaning, constructivism shifts focus from what the world is to how we come to understand it in the first place. Logic, the foundation of reasoning. Logic is the backbone of rational thought and one of philosophy's most precise tools for separating good thinking from bad. If you say all cats are mammals and your pet is a cat, then it has to be a mammal. That's logic. Clean, simple, and hard to argue with. Logic is the branch of philosophy that studies the rules of correct reasoning. It helps us figure out which arguments make sense and which ones fall apart. Instead of focusing on what we believe, logic looks at how we think and whether our conclusions follow from our starting points. At its most basic level, logic deals with statements and their relationships. If one thing is true, what else must be true because of it? This structure is what makes logical thinking so powerful. It creates chains of reasoning that are clear, predictable, and testable. There are different types of logic, but the two most common are deductive and inductive. Deductive logic starts with general principles and applies them to specific cases. For example, all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. If the starting points are true, the conclusion has to be true. Inductive logic works the other way. It looks at patterns in specific examples to form general conclusions, like noticing that the sun rises every morning and concluding that it probably will tomorrow too. Inductive reasoning isn't as certain as deduction, but it's useful for everyday decision-making and science. Modern logic also includes symbolic systems, ways to represent arguments using symbols and formulas, much like math. These tools help break down complex reasoning into simpler parts, especially when evaluating abstract ideas. Logic doesn't tell us what's true, but it tells us what follows from what. It's essential for building sound arguments and identifying fallacies in reasoning. Dialectics, progress through opposition. Dialectics transforms conflict into progress. When two people strongly disagree, it's easy to assume only one of them can be right. But in philosophy, disagreement can be the starting point for deeper understanding. That's where dialectics comes in. Dialectics is a method of thinking and reasoning that focuses on resolving contradictions. Instead of treating opposing ideas as a problem, dialectics treats them as fuel, something that drives development, learning, and change. The basic structure of dialectics usually involves 3 stages. First, there's a starting idea or position, often called a thesis. Then comes a challenge to that idea, known as the antithesis. Finally, through the tension between the two, a new idea emerges, a synthesis that combines elements of both and moves the conversation forward. This approach goes back to ancient Greece, especially in the dialogues of Socrates, who questioned people's beliefs through conversation to push them toward clearer thinking. But dialectics became more formalized with later thinkers like Hegel, who used it to explain how ideas evolve over time through conflict and resolution. Marx and Engels took the concept further, applying dialectics to history, politics, and economics. They argued that social change happens through class struggle, another kind of contradiction, leading to new political and economic systems. This became known as dialectical materialism. Dialectics doesn't just apply to grand theories. You can see it in everyday life. For example, when two teammates disagree on how to solve a problem, they might argue, rethink, and eventually find a solution that's better than what either started with. That's dialectical thinking in action. At its core, dialectics is a tool for understanding how ideas develop through opposition. It values conflict not as something to avoid, but as something that helps us get to clearer, more complete understandings of the world. Deduction, from general to specific. Deduction is one of the clearest tools we have for figuring out what follows from what. If all humans are mortal and Socrates is a human, then Socrates must be mortal. That kind of reasoning is called deduction. Deduction is a type of logical thinking where you start with general rules and apply them to specific cases. If your starting points are true and your reasoning is valid, then your conclusion has to be true. It's not a guess or a probability. It's a guarantee as long as everything is in order. This method has been used in philosophy and science for thousands of years. It helps clarify arguments, eliminate contradictions, and build airtight conclusions from solid foundations. In a way, it's like a chain reaction. Once the first links are locked in place, everything else naturally follows. Deductive reasoning is especially useful in formal systems like mathematics. If you know that all squares are rectangles and you know that this shape is a square, then you can confidently say it's also a rectangle. You're not checking reality. You're working through definitions and rules. But deduction has limits. It depends entirely on the truth of its premises. If your starting points are wrong, the conclusion might still be logically valid, but it won't reflect the real world. For example, if someone says all fish can fly, goldfish are fish, therefore goldfish can fly, the logic holds, but the first statement doesn't. That's why deduction is often paired with observation-based reasoning like induction. One gives structure, the other gives input. Together they help form a fuller picture of how we reason, argue, and understand. Deduction offers a powerful framework for thinking clearly. It's about taking what we know and following it to where it logically leads. No shortcuts, just straight reasoning. Induction, from specific to general. Induction is how we make educated guesses about what's likely to happen based on patterns we've observed. The sun has risen every day so far, so it's probably going to rise tomorrow. That's induction, reasoning from patterns to make general conclusions. Induction is a method of thinking where we observe specific examples and use them to form broader ideas. It doesn't guarantee certainty, but it helps us make educated guesses about what's likely to happen. This kind of reasoning plays a huge role in everyday life, science, and how we build knowledge from experience. The basic structure of induction looks like this. You notice a repeated pattern, and you draw a conclusion based on that pattern. For example, if you see that every time you water a plant it grows, you might conclude that watering helps plants grow. You don't have to test every plant on Earth. You assume the pattern will hold. Inductive reasoning is especially useful in science. Scientists run experiments, collect data, and then make general statements about how nature works. But induction isn't foolproof. Just because something has happened many times doesn't mean it always will. That's the core of the problem of induction, famously raised by philosopher David Hume. His point was that there's no logical guarantee that the future will always resemble the past. Still, despite its limits, induction is practical. We rely on it to make decisions, set expectations, and learn from experience. Weather forecasts, medical research, and even daily routines all use inductive logic. It's how we make sense of a world that's constantly changing and full of unknowns. Induction may not offer absolute certainty, but it gives us a way to move from observation to understanding. It's how we take what we've seen and turn it into something useful, an informed guess about what comes next. Abduction. Finding the best explanation. Abduction is the thinking process we use to solve everyday mysteries. You walk into your kitchen and see water on the floor. You didn't see it spill, but you notice the dog's bowl is tipped over, so you guess the dog probably did it. That's abduction, figuring out the most likely explanation from what you know. Abduction, also known as inference to the best explanation, is a form of reasoning where we start with an observation and then try to come up with the most plausible cause. Unlike deduction, which guarantees a conclusion if the premises are true, and unlike induction, which draws patterns from repeated cases, abduction is about picking the explanation that fits best, even if it's not certain. This kind of thinking is common in everyday life. If your phone isn't charging, you might assume the cable is broken. You haven't tested everything yet, but based on past experience, it seems like the most reasonable explanation. Doctors use abduction when diagnosing symptoms. Detectives use it when piecing together clues. It's how we move from confusing situations to coherent stories. The term was introduced by American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce. He believed that abduction plays a key role in the way we form new ideas. It's often the first step in problem solving, what gets us from scattered evidence to a working theory. Of course, abduction isn't foolproof. The best explanation might not always be the correct one, but it's a practical way of reasoning when time, information, or certainty is limited. It helps us make sense of the unknown by filling in the blanks with what seems most likely. Abduction is what drives us to ask, what's going on here? And then come up with a smart guess. It's the thinking behind insights, discoveries, and those everyday moments when something just clicks. Fallibilism. Knowledge can be wrong. Fallibilism reminds us to stay intellectually humble. Everyone makes mistakes, but what if that idea applied not just to people, but to knowledge itself? That's the central idea behind fallibilism. Fallibilism is the philosophical view that no belief or theory is ever completely immune to error. It doesn't mean everything is wrong, it just means that no matter how confident we are, there's always a chance we could be mistaken. Even our best knowledge is provisional, open to revision if better evidence comes along. The concept grew out of modern science and philosophy. Thinkers like Charles Sanders Peirce and Karl Popper promoted the idea that knowledge should always remain flexible. In science, for example, a theory can be incredibly well supported by experiments and data, but scientists don't treat it as final truth. They treat it as the best current explanation until something better appears. Fallibilism pushes back against the idea that we can ever reach absolute certainty. Take something as everyday as using GPS. You follow the directions assuming they're correct, but sometimes the GPS is wrong. Fallibilism encourages that mindset on a larger scale. It reminds us that any belief, no matter how trusted, might need to change. This doesn't mean we should doubt everything all the time. Fallibilism is compatible with having strong beliefs, using evidence, and making decisions. But it also promotes intellectual humility, the willingness to admit we might be wrong, and to keep an open mind when new information comes in. In philosophy, fallibilism challenges rigid systems that claim to offer final answers. Instead, it supports a view of knowledge as something we're constantly improving, refining, and sometimes correcting. It's not a weakness, it's a strategy for dealing with a complex world where certainty is rare and learning never really stops. Paradox, when logic breaks down. Paradox challenges the limits of our thinking. If a barber shaves everyone in town who doesn't shave themselves, who shaves the barber? That's a paradox, a situation where logic seems to break down, even though every step seems to make sense. In philosophy, a paradox is a statement or situation that leads to a contradiction or a result that defies common sense. It often arises when two or more seemingly reasonable ideas clash, making it difficult or sometimes impossible to figure out what's actually true. Paradoxes come in different forms. Some are logical, like the liar paradox, where someone says, "This statement is false. If it's true, then it's false, but if it's false, then it must be true." Others are more practical, like Zeno's paradoxes, which argue that motion is impossible, because you'd have to complete an infinite number of steps just to walk across a room. What makes paradoxes interesting is that they don't just confuse, they reveal. A good paradox doesn't just show a flaw in thinking, it points to limits in the way we define concepts, use language, or apply logic. They force us to rethink what we thought we understood. Philosophers use paradoxes as tools. They help test the strength of arguments, expose assumptions, and refine definitions. In science and math, paradoxes have even led to breakthroughs. Russell's paradox, for example, exposed problems in early set theory and helped shape modern logic. Paradoxes aren't problems to be solved and forgotten. They're puzzles that sharpen thinking by challenging us to hold two conflicting ideas at once. They show how complex and layered our understanding of reality really is. They might not always have a clear answer, but they always leave us thinking more carefully about the questions we ask. Falsifiability, the test of scientific ideas. Falsifiability separates science from pseudoscience. If someone says invisible aliens are watching you at all times but leave no trace, there's not much you can do to prove them wrong. That's exactly why falsifiability matters. Falsifiability is the idea that for a claim to be scientific or meaningful in a testable way, there has to be a possible scenario where it could be proven false. It doesn't mean the claim is false. It just means there must be a way, in theory, to show that it could be. The concept became central to the philosophy of science thanks to Karl Popper, who argued that what separates science from pseudoscience is testability. For example, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level is falsifiable. You can test it with an experiment. But something like everything happens for a reason isn't falsifiable. It can't be tested or disproven because no matter what happens, the phrase still fits. Falsifiability helps scientists and thinkers focus on ideas that can be challenged and improved. A theory that can't be wrong also can't really be confirmed. It just floats above evidence. On the other hand, a falsifiable theory invites scrutiny, testing, and revision, which makes it stronger over time. In everyday life, the idea is just as useful. If someone claims they're always right but never accept proof to the contrary, they're not being reasonable, they're avoiding falsifiability. A belief that can't be questioned might sound confident, but it's cut off from reality. Falsifiability sets a clear boundary. If something can be tested, it can be taken seriously. If it can't be tested or challenged, it may still be interesting, but it's not in the same category as knowledge we can build on, verify, or refine through evidence. Analytic philosophy. Clarity through language. Analytic philosophy brings precision to big questions. Some philosophies aim to explore life's big mysteries. Analytic philosophy aims to make those mysteries clearer by breaking them down step by step using logic and language. Analytic philosophy is a modern approach that focuses on clarity, precision, and argument structure. Instead of diving into abstract theories or grand metaphysical systems, analytic philosophers take apart ideas carefully to see exactly what's being claimed and whether it holds up. The goal isn't to offer poetic insights, but to make complex thoughts as understandable and accurate as possible. This tradition took shape in the early 20th century, led by thinkers like Bertrand Russell, G.E. Moore, and later Ludwig Wittgenstein. They believed many philosophical problems weren't really problems at all, just confusions caused by unclear language. If we sharpened how we talk about things, many so-called mysteries might disappear. Analytic philosophy often uses logic to map out arguments. For example, if someone says all bachelors are unmarried, an analytic philosopher might point out that this is true by definition. It doesn't need further evidence. That's called an analytic statement, and figuring out how these differ from more complex claims is a big part of the work. The subjects analytic philosophy covers are broad: ethics, knowledge, science, politics, but they're all approached with the same method. Break the question into parts, define the terms, examine the logic, and see if the conclusion follows. While it might sound technical, this style of philosophy has shaped everything from modern logic to debates about artificial intelligence. It's about getting rid of vagueness, avoiding confusion, and building arguments you can actually test and challenge. Analytic philosophy doesn't claim to answer every deep question, but it insists that whatever answers we explore, they should be clear, logical, and built on solid reasoning. Linguistic turn: language shapes thought. The linguistic turn changed how philosophers approach big questions. If you've ever argued with someone and realized the problem wasn't the idea but the words being used, you've already touched on the core of the linguistic turn. The linguistic turn is a major shift in 20th century philosophy that put language at the center of philosophical inquiry. Instead of focusing only on ideas, thoughts, or experiences, philosophers started asking how the words we use shape the way we understand those things. The basic claim is simple: to understand a concept, you first need to understand the language used to describe it. Before this shift, philosophy often tried to get straight to the truth of things: what's real, what's right, what's meaningful. But linguistic philosophers argued that these questions can't be answered clearly without first asking what we mean by words like real, right, or meaning. Misunderstandings, they suggested, often happen not because of bad logic, but because of vague or misleading language. This shift was influenced by figures like Ludwig Wittgenstein, who believed that many philosophical problems were actually problems of language. If we could untangle how language works, how words refer to things, how meaning is created, and how context shapes understanding, we might solve or even dissolve many classic philosophical puzzles. The linguistic turn didn't just affect philosophy, it had an impact on linguistics, psychology, computer science, and even literary theory. By focusing on language, it gave scholars a new set of tools for analyzing how people think, communicate, and interpret the world around them. At its core, the linguistic turn redefined the path to knowledge. It said that words aren't just labels, they're part of the structure of thought itself. And to do philosophy well, you have to get the language right first. Existentialism: freedom and meaning. Existentialism wrestles with life's most personal questions. Existentialism is a philosophical movement that focuses on human freedom, individuality, and the challenge of creating meaning in a world that doesn't provide it for you. It became especially influential in the 20th century shaped by thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and Albert Camus. At its core, existentialism starts with the idea that existence comes before essence. In simpler terms, people exist first and only later define who they are through choices and actions. Unlike a knife, which is made with a specific purpose, humans aren't born with a built-in function. Instead, they have to figure it out as they go. This freedom sounds empowering, but it also comes with pressure. If no one else can decide your purpose for you, then you're fully responsible for shaping your life. That responsibility can lead to anxiety, doubt, or what existentialists call angst. But it also means that meaning isn't something to be discovered, it's something to be made. Existentialism also wrestles with the idea of absurdity, the conflict between our desire for meaning and a universe that doesn't guarantee any. Camus famously used the image of Sisyphus, a man doomed to push a boulder uphill forever to show what it means to keep going even when life feels pointless. This philosophy isn't about despair, it's about realism. Existentialism doesn't offer comforting answers, but it does offer clarity. You're not stuck in a system you didn't choose. You have the power to define your own values and live by them, even in the face of uncertainty. That, according to existentialism, is what makes life truly yours. Nihilism, the absence of inherent meaning. Nihilism confronts us with existence's starkest possibility. If nothing matters, does anything mean anything at all? That's the unsettling starting point of nihilism. Nihilism is the philosophical belief that life lacks inherent meaning, value, or purpose. It suggests that moral systems, social structures, and even truth itself are not fixed or objective. They're human inventions. At its core, nihilism challenges the idea that the world has built-in significance waiting to be discovered. This idea isn't just a mood or a reaction to disappointment. It's a serious philosophical position that's been explored by thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche. Though often misunderstood, nihilism doesn't automatically mean despair. It's more about confronting the possibility that the beliefs we've built our lives around might not be grounded in anything solid. There are different types of nihilism. Existential nihilism questions whether human life has any true meaning. Moral nihilism doubts that there are any universal moral truths. Epistemological nihilism goes even further, suggesting that knowledge itself might not be possible. In practice, nihilism can feel like hitting a wall. If traditional values and beliefs don't hold up to scrutiny, what's left? For some, that question leads to apathy or cynicism, but others use it as a turning point. If nothing is inherently meaningful, then maybe meaning is something we're free to create ourselves. Nihilism became especially prominent in the modern era as religious certainty declined and science replaced old worldviews. But rather than just erase old answers, nihilism opens up a new kind of challenge: how to live in a world without guarantees, where certainty is out of reach. As a philosophy, nihilism doesn't offer comfort or reassurance, but it does offer honesty. It strips things down to their core and asks us to consider what remains when all the usual assumptions fall away. Absurdism, the search for meaning in a meaningless world. Absurdism finds meaning in the gap between our human longing and the universe's indifference. You wake up, go to work, pay bills, make plans, doing your best to live a meaningful life. But the world doesn't give you any clear reason why. That disconnect is what absurdism is all about. Absurdism is a philosophical idea that centers on the clash between our search for meaning and the lack of any guaranteed meaning in the universe. It doesn't say life is meaningless. It says we want meaning, and the universe doesn't offer it in any obvious way. That gap between what we expect and what we get is called the absurd. The idea became well known through the work of Albert Camus. He wasn't saying life is hopeless. In fact, his whole point was that the absurd is a condition we all face, and the way we respond to it matters. The absurd isn't something to solve or escape, it's something to recognize and live with. A good example is the story of Sisyphus, a figure from Greek mythology. He's punished by the gods, forced to roll a giant boulder up a hill forever, only for it to roll back down each time. To many, that sounds like a nightmare. But Camus used it to explain how humans deal with absurdity. The task may never end, but we still keep pushing. Absurdism isn't about giving up, it's about rejecting false answers, those neat explanations that claim to give life meaning when they don't really hold up. Instead, it encourages people to face reality head-on, even when it's messy or unclear. At its core, absurdism is about honesty. It doesn't offer comfort or certainty, but it does give a framework for how to live in a world that doesn't explain itself and how to keep going anyway. Authenticity, being true to yourself. Authenticity is about living in alignment with your true self. Being true to yourself sounds simple, but in a world full of expectations, it's anything but. That's the heart of the philosophical idea known as authenticity. In philosophy, authenticity is about living in a way that's honest and aligned with your own values, rather than just following social norms, traditions, or the expectations of others. It means making choices based on what you genuinely believe, not just what's convenient or what other people approve of. The idea became central to existentialist philosophy, especially in the 20th century. Thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir saw authenticity as a response to the freedom and responsibility that come with being human. Since there's no fixed blueprint for how to live, they argued, people have to create their own meaning and do it sincerely. Authenticity isn't about rejecting society altogether. It's about making conscious decisions rather than going through life on autopilot. For example, taking a job just because it looks impressive to others might feel inauthentic if it goes against what really matters to you. On the other hand, choosing a path that matches your own goals, even if it's less popular, would reflect a more authentic approach. This concept also shows up in discussions about identity. Authentic living involves acknowledging who you are, including your limitations and contradictions, and not hiding behind roles or masks to avoid judgment. It requires self-awareness, courage, and a willingness to take responsibility for your actions. Authenticity challenges the idea that success is about meeting external standards. Instead, it focuses on internal consistency, living in a way that feels real, even when it's difficult. In that sense, authenticity isn't just a personal goal, it's a philosophical commitment to living a life that's genuinely your own. Alienation, disconnection in modern life. Alienation names that feeling of disconnect many experience in modern society. You go to work, follow the routine, check the boxes, but somehow it all feels distant, like you're just going through the motions. That feeling has a name in philosophy: alienation. Alienation describes the sense of being disconnected from your work, from other people, from society, or even from yourself. It's not just about being alone. It's about feeling out of place in a world that doesn't seem to reflect who you are or what you value. The concept became central in the work of Karl Marx, who used it to explain how workers in industrial societies often become detached from what they produce. In a factory, for example, a worker might spend hours assembling a single part of a product without ever seeing the final result. They don't own what they make. They don't control how they work. Over time, that lack of connection leads to a feeling of estrangement, not just from the job, but from the human experience of creating something meaningful. Marx identified several forms of alienation: alienation from the product, from the process of labor, from other people, and even from one's own sense of purpose. The more repetitive and impersonal the work, the stronger that disconnect can become. But the idea didn't stay in economics. Existentialist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir expanded it to everyday life. They looked at how social roles, expectations, and institutions can pull people away from their authentic selves. When you feel like you're just playing a part or living someone else's script, that's also a form of alienation. In philosophy, alienation is more than a mood. It's a clue that something about modern life isn't lining up with human needs. It raises questions about freedom, meaning, and what it takes to feel truly connected to the world you live in. Freedom and determinism. Are we really free? Freedom and determinism debate the reality of choice. You choose what to eat, where to go, what to say. It feels like you're in control. But what if every one of those choices was already set in motion long before you made it? That's the debate between freedom and determinism. It asks whether human beings genuinely have free will or whether every decision we make is shaped by prior causes like genetics, environment, upbringing, or even the laws of physics. Determinism is the idea that everything in the universe follows a chain of cause and effect. If you knew all the variables, your brain chemistry, your experiences, the state of the world, you could, in theory, predict every decision you'd ever make. From this perspective, free will might just be an illusion. On the other side is the belief in freedom. Philosophers who support this view argue that humans can choose between alternatives even when influenced by past events. They say we're not just reacting, we're deciding. But the debate doesn't end there. Some thinkers propose a middle ground called compatibilism. This view says that free will and determinism aren't necessarily enemies. As long as your decisions come from your own desires and reasoning, not from coercion or manipulation, you can still be considered free, even if those desires have causes. These questions don't just belong in philosophy classrooms. They affect how we think about morality, responsibility, and justice. If someone's actions are determined by things beyond their control, can they really be blamed or praised? The tension between freedom and determinism forces us to examine what it really means to make a choice, whether we're truly free, partly free, or not free at all. The way we answer this shapes how we see ourselves and how we understand human behavior. Free will, the power to choose. Free will lies at the heart of how we understand ourselves as agents in the world. You decide what to wear, what to eat, and when to speak. It feels like those decisions come from you and only you. That feeling is at the heart of one of philosophy's biggest ideas, free will. Free will is the belief that people have the ability to make choices that are not completely determined by outside forces. It means your actions aren't just the result of instincts, genetics, or environmental conditions. They're something you actively choose. In short, you could have done otherwise. The concept sounds simple, but it quickly gets complicated. If your thoughts and decisions are shaped by your brain, and your brain follows the laws of physics, then aren't your choices just part of a larger chain of cause and effect? That's the challenge raised by determinism, the idea that everything, including human behavior, has a cause. Philosophers have responded to this in different ways. Libertarians, in the philosophical sense, believe true free will exists, and that we can sometimes step outside the chain of cause and effect to choose freely. Determinists, on the other hand, argue that our choices are fully determined, even if we feel like we're free. Then there's compatibilism, a middle ground view. Compatibilists say free will doesn't require complete freedom from causation. As long as you're acting according to your own motivations, not being forced, you can still be considered free, even if those motivations have causes. This debate has major implications. If people don't have free will, it challenges how we think about responsibility, praise, and blame. It even impacts legal systems, ethics, and personal identity. Free will sits at the center of how we understand human agency. Whether we fully control our choices or just believe we do, the concept plays a major role in how we live, act, and relate to others. Compatibilism, finding middle ground. Compatibilism reconciles freedom with causation. You choose your meal, hit the snooze button, or start a new job, and it feels like you're in control. But what if every one of those choices was already influenced by your past? That's where compatibilism steps in. Compatibilism is the philosophical view that free will and determinism can coexist. At first, it seems like a contradiction. Determinism says every event, including human decisions, is caused by prior events. Free will suggests we have control and could have acted differently. Compatibilism bridges that gap by redefining what it means to act freely. According to compatibilists, freedom doesn't require total independence from all causes. Instead, they argue that a decision is free if it comes from within you, your desires, preferences, and reasoning, not from external pressure or force. So even if those inner thoughts have causes, your action is still considered voluntary and meaningful. For example, if you decide to read a book because you genuinely enjoy it, that's a free action, even if your interest in reading was shaped by your upbringing. But if someone threatens you to read it at gunpoint, that's clearly not free. The difference isn't whether your choice has causes, but whether those causes reflect your own internal motivations. This idea has practical implications. It supports the view that people can be held responsible for their actions, even in a determined universe, because what matters is whether they acted according to their own reasons. Compatibilism doesn't dismiss determinism, and it doesn't ignore the importance of choice. It reframes the debate by showing that human freedom isn't about escaping cause and effect. It's about acting in ways that align with who we are and what we care about within the world we're part of. Hard determinism. No choice at all. Hard determinism challenges our most basic assumptions about choice. You hit the snooze button, grab your usual coffee, and take the same route to work. It all feels like your choice, but hard determinism says otherwise. Hard determinism is the philosophical view that free will is an illusion. It claims that every thought, decision, and action is the result of prior causes. Things like genetics, upbringing, environment, and physical laws. If everything that happens has a cause, then your choices were always going to happen exactly the way they did. In this view, the universe operates like a machine. If you know all the parts and how they interact, you could, in theory, predict every future event, including human behavior. Hard determinists accept that our decisions feel personal and intentional, but argue that those decisions were shaped by factors we didn't choose and can't change. Take a simple example. You choose chocolate ice cream over vanilla. It might seem like a free choice, but hard determinism says that decision was shaped by your past experiences, your taste preferences, and even your brain chemistry in that moment. Given those conditions, you couldn't have chosen anything else. This has big implications for morality and responsibility. If people aren't truly free to choose their actions, can they really be blamed for them? Hard determinists say moral responsibility, as we usually think of it, might need rethinking. Punishment or praise based on choice becomes complicated when no one could have done otherwise. Hard determinism isn't about giving up or ignoring behavior. It's about understanding human actions as part of a larger causal system. Rather than focusing on blame, it encourages us to look at the deeper factors that drive behavior. Factors that might help us build a more informed and realistic view of human nature. Panpsychism, consciousness everywhere. Panpsychism presents one of the most surprising perspectives on consciousness. You know you're conscious, you think, feel, and experience the world, but what if even a rock or a grain of sand had some tiny spark of consciousness too? Panpsychism is the philosophical view that consciousness isn't limited to humans or animals. It's a fundamental feature of the entire universe. According to this theory, all matter has some form of mental property, no matter how simple or basic it might be. The idea isn't that rocks have thoughts or personalities, but that the building blocks of matter, atoms, particles, or fields, might each contain a faint element of experience. The challenge of consciousness, how it arises from physical matter, has puzzled philosophers and scientists for centuries. This is sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness. Panpsychism offers a different approach. Instead of trying to explain how consciousness suddenly appears in complex brains, it suggests that consciousness was always there, just in a much simpler form. Think of it like this. Complex consciousness like ours could be the result of combining many tiny conscious units, just like a living organism is made from cells. Each unit on its own isn't much, but together they create something rich and aware. This idea has deep roots in philosophy, going back to thinkers like Plato and Spinoza. In recent years, it's been taken more seriously by some contemporary philosophers and scientists who are exploring alternatives to traditional materialist views. Panpsychism doesn't mean the universe is thinking in the way people do. It simply raises the possibility that mind and matter are more closely connected than we've assumed. Instead of being rare and special, consciousness might be built into the fabric of everything, a basic ingredient of reality, present everywhere, just in different degrees. Philosophy of mind, understanding consciousness. Philosophy of mind tackles some of the deepest questions about our inner experience. Your thoughts, memories, feelings, even the sense that you're you, all come from your mind. But what is the mind? That's the core question behind the philosophy of mind. The philosophy of mind is a branch of philosophy that explores the nature of mental states, consciousness, and how they relate to the physical body, especially the brain. It tackles big questions like, what is consciousness? How do thoughts relate to brain activity? And can machines ever think the way humans do? One of the central debates in this field is the mind-body problem. On one side, physicalists believe that the mind is entirely the result of physical processes. According to this view, mental states like happiness or pain are just brain states, patterns of neurons firing. On the other side, dualists argue that the mind is something more than just the physical brain, possibly even a separate, non-physical substance. Another key concept is consciousness, the feeling of being aware. You're not just reacting to the world like a machine, you experience it. Philosophers try to explain how that inner world, what it's like to see red, feel sadness, or remember your birthday, can emerge from physical matter, if it does at all. There's also the question of artificial intelligence. If a computer could replicate every function of a human brain, would it have a mind? Would it be conscious, or just simulating thought? The philosophy of mind doesn't just deal with abstract theory. It connects directly to neuroscience, psychology, and computer science. It's one of the most active areas in modern philosophy because it cuts to the heart of what it means to think, to feel, and to be a person. It's not just about how the mind works, but what the mind is in the first place. Consciousness, the inner experience. Consciousness is perhaps the most intimate yet mysterious aspect of human experience. You know what it's like to feel tired, hear music, or remember your last vacation. That inner experience, the feeling of being aware, is what we call consciousness. In philosophy, consciousness refers to the state of having thoughts, sensations, or awareness of the world and yourself. It's not just about reacting to things, it's about having an experience while doing so. Consciousness is what separates being awake from just functioning like a machine. At first glance, consciousness seems simple, but it turns out to be one of the most difficult concepts to fully explain. Philosophers and scientists often describe it as the hard problem, not because it's impossible, but because even with all our understanding of the brain, we still don't know why certain brain processes feel like something from the inside. For example, you can scan someone's brain while they look at the color red. You might see which neurons light up, but that doesn't tell you what redness feels like to them. That subjective quality, what it's like to see, feel, or think, is called qualia. It's central to discussions about consciousness, but also extremely tricky to pin down. There are different theories about where consciousness comes from. Physicalist theories say it emerges entirely from brain activity. Panpsychist views suggest consciousness might be a fundamental feature of the universe, built into even the smallest particles. Others explore whether consciousness might be more like a process, shaped by complex interactions between perception, memory, and attention. Understanding consciousness isn't just about curiosity, it has real-world impact. It shapes how we approach mental health, artificial intelligence, animal rights, and the nature of self. In philosophy, consciousness isn't treated as just another mental process. It's the core of what it means to have a mind at all. Qualia, the raw feel of experience. Qualia refers to those intimate aspects of experience that can never be fully shared. You know what chocolate tastes like, what red looks like, and what it feels like to stub your toe. But no one else can experience those things exactly the way you do. That private, personal side of experience is what philosophers call qualia. Qualia refers to the raw, subjective qualities of conscious experience, what it's like to see a color, feel pain, or hear a melody. It's not just the fact that your brain reacts to light or sound, it's the inner experience that comes with it. For example, the color red might trigger the same part of the brain in different people, but the way red actually feels could be completely unique to each individual. This concept sits at the center of debates in the philosophy of mind. Some argue that qualia are proof that there's more to consciousness than just physical processes. You can describe how the brain works when you see a rose, but that doesn't explain what the rose actually looks like to you. One famous thought experiment called Mary's Room explores this idea. Mary is a scientist who knows everything there is to know about color, wavelengths, optics, and brain responses, but she's lived her entire life in a black and white room. The question is, when she sees color for the first time, does she learn something new? If she does, that new knowledge is qualia, not theory, but experience. Not everyone agrees that qualia are real or meaningful. Some philosophers argue they're just illusions created by the brain. Others believe they're essential to understanding what consciousness truly is. Either way, qualia point to a central puzzle. How can something so real to each of us, like the taste of coffee or the sound of rain, be so hard to define, explain, or share with anyone else? Dual aspect theory, two sides of reality. Dual aspect theory offers an intriguing middle ground between materialism and dualism. You have a brain that reacts to the world and a mind that thinks, feels, and experiences it. But are those two different things or two sides of the same thing? That's the key question behind dual aspect theory. Dual aspect theory is a philosophical idea that suggests the mind and the body aren't separate substances, like traditional dualism claims. Instead, they're two different ways of looking at the same underlying reality. Think of it like flipping a coin. Heads and tails are different, but they're part of the same object. This idea was developed as a way to navigate between two major views. On one side, materialism says everything, including the mind, can be explained in terms of physical matter, like neurons firing in the brain. On the other, dualism argues that mind and matter are completely different substances, often raising hard questions about how they interact. Dual aspect theory offers a middle path. It suggests that the mind and the body aren't separate things and aren't reducible to one another. Instead, they're different aspects or perspectives of the same underlying process or substance. One aspect is physical, the brain and body we can observe. The other is mental, the thoughts and experiences we feel from the inside. This framework helps explain why we can talk about emotions in two ways, as patterns in the brain or as felt experiences like joy or sadness. They're not competing descriptions but complementary ones. While dual aspect theory doesn't answer every question about consciousness, it offers a compelling way to think about the connection between brain and mind. It avoids reducing one to the other while still keeping them part of the same reality, just viewed from two different angles. Identity theory. Mind is brain. Identity theory takes a clear stance on the mind-body problem. When you feel excited, scared, or curious, it all seems to happen in your mind. But according to identity theory, those mental states are brain states, nothing more, nothing less. Identity theory is a view in the philosophy of mind that claims mental states are identical to physical states in the brain. It doesn't just say they're connected or correlated. It says they are the same thing, just described in different ways. So when you feel pain, for example, that feeling isn't separate from your brain activity. It is the brain activity. This idea took shape in the mid-20th century, especially through the work of philosophers and neuroscientists looking to connect philosophy with discoveries in brain science. The theory fits well with a materialist view of the world, which holds that everything, including thoughts and emotions, can be explained by physical processes. An easy way to picture it is like lightning and electrical discharge. People used to see lightning as something mysterious. Now we know it is a form of electricity. Identity theory suggests the same about the mind. What we call thoughts or feelings are just the inner experience of physical brain events. Supporters of identity theory like that. It offers a straightforward, science-friendly explanation of the mind. It doesn't rely on anything supernatural or hidden. It keeps everything grounded in the physical world. Still, the theory faces challenges. Critics argue that even if brain activity and mental states happen together, that doesn't prove they're the same. And it doesn't fully explain why brain activity feels like something from the inside, what philosophers call subjective experience or qualia. Even with these questions, identity theory remains a major influence in discussions about consciousness. It provides a clear framework for understanding how the mind might emerge from the brain without separating the two. Functionalism. Mind as function. Functionalism shifts our focus from what the mind is made of to what it does. If you press a button on a vending machine and it gives you a snack, you probably don't care how it works, just that it works. That basic idea is at the heart of functionalism in philosophy of mind. Functionalism is the theory that what matters most about mental states like beliefs, thoughts, or emotions is not what they're made of, but what they do. It focuses on how mental states function within a larger system, like inputs leading to outputs, much like parts in a machine or steps in a computer program. According to functionalism, the mind is defined by the roles it plays. For example, the mental state of pain isn't about a specific type of brain cell firing. It's about how the system processes injury, responding with withdrawal, increased attention, and the motivation to avoid that situation in the future. If something performs that same function, it counts as experiencing pain regardless of what it's made of. This flexibility is one of functionalism's biggest strengths. It allows for the possibility that minds could be realized in many different forms: human brains, animal brains, or even artificial systems like computers or robots. As long as the system processes information the right way, it could, in theory, have mental states. Functionalism developed in response to both behaviorism, which focused only on external actions, and identity theory, which tied mental states strictly to the physical brain. Instead, functionalism offered a middle path, treating the mind as a pattern of relationships and operations, not just matter or motion. This idea has shaped fields like cognitive science, psychology, and artificial intelligence. It provides a practical, system-based view of how minds work, focusing less on what consciousness is made of and more on how it behaves and interacts with the world. Eliminative materialism, rethinking mental concepts. Eliminative materialism takes materialism to its logical conclusion. You say you're angry, hopeful, or confused, but what if those feelings don't actually exist the way we assume they do? That's the idea behind eliminative materialism, one of the most controversial views in the philosophy of mind. Eliminative materialism argues that many of the mental concepts we use every day, things like beliefs, desires, and emotions, aren't accurate reflections of what's really happening in the brain. Instead, they're outdated theories, kind of like how ancient people explained lightning with angry gods. As neuroscience progresses, eliminative materialists believe we'll move beyond this everyday mental language and replace it with scientific terms grounded in brain biology. At the core of this theory is a rejection of something called folk psychology. That's the informal system we use to explain behavior, like saying someone stayed home because they wanted to rest or believed it would rain. This kind of talk works well in casual settings, but according to eliminative materialists, it's built on shaky assumptions. They argue that as brain science advances, we won't need these vague terms at all. Take the example of memory. Folk psychology might describe forgetting as simply not trying hard enough, but neuroscience tells a more detailed story about brain regions, neurotransmitters, and specific patterns of neural activity. As our understanding deepens, the older way of talking may no longer be useful or even meaningful. Critics push back hard, saying it's unrealistic to toss out the entire mental vocabulary. After all, people clearly experience thoughts and emotions. But eliminative materialists don't deny the experiences. They question the language we use to explain them. In essence, eliminative materialism challenges us to rethink the mind, not as something mystical or private, but as something physical, measurable, and eventually explainable through science alone. Extended mind thesis, thinking beyond the brain. The extended mind thesis blurs the boundary between mind and environment. You write down a phone number, set reminders on your smartphone, or use GPS to navigate a new city. In each case, your brain is doing less and the world around you is doing more. That's the idea behind the extended mind thesis. The extended mind thesis is a theory in the philosophy of mind that challenges the idea that thinking happens only inside the head. Instead, it argues that the mind can extend beyond the brain and body into tools, technologies, and even the environment. If an external object performs the same function as part of your brain, and it plays an active role in your thinking, then it might count as part of your mind. This idea was introduced by philosophers Andy Clark and David Chalmers. They gave an example of a person named Otto, who uses a notebook to store information due to memory loss. Otto consults the notebook, as others would consult their biological memory. The notebook, in this case, becomes part of Otto's cognitive process, not just a tool, but an extension of his mind. The core argument is about function. If something helps process information in the same way your brain would, then it's not just supporting your thinking. It is part of your thinking. That could include writing notes, using calculators, or relying on smartphones to manage tasks. Critics argue that tools are just tools, that using them doesn't make them part of your mind. But supporters of the extended mind thesis point out how deeply integrated these tools have become in daily life. They're not just optional add-ons, they're active parts of how we remember, reason, and decide. This theory reshapes how we think about intelligence, identity, and even what it means to be human in a world where our thinking often happens outside of our skulls. Personal identity. What makes you you? Personal identity addresses one of our most intimate philosophical questions. You're not the same person you were 5 years ago. Your thoughts have changed, your body's changed, even your memories might feel different. Yet somehow you still think of yourself as the same you. That's the puzzle behind personal identity. In philosophy, personal identity is the study of what makes a person the same over time. It asks, what is it that ties your past, present, and future selves together as one continuous person, despite all the changes? There are a few major theories that try to answer this. One view focuses on the body. According to this perspective, you're the same person as long as you have the same physical organism. But that gets tricky. Your body changes constantly, and even parts of it can be replaced. Another approach looks at memory. Philosopher John Locke argued that continuity of consciousness, specifically memory, is what holds identity together. If you remember doing something, then you were the person who did it. But this raises questions too. Memories can fade, be inaccurate, or even be lost completely. Some theories focus on the mind more broadly. Psychological continuity suggests that as long as your personality, values, and thought patterns carry over, your identity remains. Others push back and argue that identity isn't fixed at all. It's a useful concept, but not something with a single unchanging core. There are also thought experiments that push these ideas to their limits. For example, if your brain were uploaded to a computer or split between two bodies, which one would be you? Philosophers study personal identity not just as an abstract concept, but because it connects to real issues like moral responsibility, legal rights, and end-of-life decisions. Understanding what it means to be the same person over time helps us make sense of who we are and how we change. Ship of Theseus. Identity through change. The Ship of Theseus explores the paradox of identity through change. Imagine an old wooden ship, slowly repaired over time. Each plank is replaced one by one until none of the original wood remains. Is it still the same ship? This is the Ship of Theseus, a classic thought experiment in philosophy that explores the nature of identity over time. It asks what it really means for something to stay the same when all of its parts have changed. Originally told by ancient Greek philosophers, the story goes like this. The ship belonging to the hero Theseus is preserved in a museum. Over the years, worn-out pieces are swapped with new ones. Eventually, every single component is replaced. So, is it still Theseus's ship? Some say yes, because it's been maintained as a continuous structure. Others say no, because none of the original material remains. The question becomes even more complicated when a twist is added. Suppose someone collects all the discarded original planks and reassembles them into a ship. Now there are two ships, one made of new parts in the same location and one made of old parts in a new location. Which one, if either, is the real Ship of Theseus? Philosophers use this scenario to explore personal identity, objects over time, and how we define sameness. A similar puzzle applies to humans. Our cells are constantly replaced, our personalities and memories evolve, yet we continue to see ourselves as the same person. The Ship of Theseus doesn't offer a simple answer. It reveals how our ideas of identity rely on continuity, history, and sometimes intuition. It's a useful tool for understanding not just objects, but how we think about change, permanence, and what makes something or someone who or what they are. Ethics, understanding right and wrong. Ethics is the branch of philosophy that studies what's right and wrong, and why certain actions are considered good or bad. It's not just about following rules, it's about understanding what kind of life we should live, how we should treat others, and what principles should guide our decisions. At the foundation of ethics are three major approaches. The first is consequentialism, which says the right action is the one that leads to the best outcome. The most well-known version is utilitarianism, which focuses on maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering. For example, if telling a lie would save someone's life, a consequentialist might say it's the right thing to do. The second is deontology, which focuses on rules and duties rather than results. According to this view, some actions are simply right or wrong, no matter the consequences. Telling the truth, for instance, is a duty, even if it leads to a difficult outcome. The third is virtue ethics, which centers on the kind of person you are rather than any one action. It's about developing good character traits like honesty, courage, and compassion, so that doing the right thing becomes second nature. Ethics doesn't just apply to personal choices. It plays a key role in law, medicine, business, technology, and public policy. It asks how we should live together in a society, how we resolve conflicts, and how we balance individual freedom with responsibility to others. Philosophers explore ethics to better understand what fairness, justice, and integrity really mean, and how we can apply those ideas in the real world. Virtue ethics, character over rules. Virtue ethics emphasizes the role of character in moral life. When someone does the right thing not for praise or rules but simply because it's who they are, it's easy to admire that. That's the core of virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is a branch of moral philosophy that focuses on character over rules or outcomes. Instead of asking, "What should I do in this situation?" it asks, "What kind of person should I be?" The idea is that good actions naturally follow from good character traits like honesty, courage, patience, and generosity. This approach dates back to ancient Greece, especially to the philosopher Aristotle. He believed that becoming a good person involves developing habits that shape your character over time. According to virtue ethics, morality isn't about strict rules or calculated results. It's about living a well-rounded, meaningful life by cultivating virtues. Virtues are developed through practice. You become brave by acting bravely, fair by acting fairly. These traits don't come from memorizing guidelines. They grow from experience, reflection, and learning from others. That's why role models matter so much in virtue ethics. We learn what virtue looks like by watching people we respect. One of the key ideas here is moderation. Aristotle famously emphasized the golden mean, the idea that virtue often lies between two extremes. For example, courage isn't recklessness or cowardice, but something in between. Generosity isn't giving everything away or being stingy. It's finding a balanced response based on context. Virtue ethics also considers emotions and relationships essential to moral life. It sees people not as isolated decision-makers, but as social beings whose actions are shaped by the communities they live in. Rather than offering a formula for right and wrong, virtue ethics encourages lifelong character development. It's about becoming the kind of person whose actions naturally align with integrity, wisdom, and moral strength. Stoicism, controlling what you can. Stoicism offers a practical philosophy for dealing with life's challenges. You can't control the traffic, the weather, or what people say about you. But according to Stoicism, that's not what matters. What matters is how you respond. Stoicism is a school of philosophy that began in ancient Greece and became especially popular in Rome. It teaches that the key to a good life isn't wealth, fame, or even comfort. It's living in harmony with reason, accepting what you can't change, and focusing on what you can. At its core, Stoicism draws a sharp line between what's in your control and what isn't. Your actions, thoughts, and choices, those are up to you. Everything else, other people's opinions, outcomes, even your own body to some extent, is not. A Stoic works to master their inner life rather than chase external rewards or run from discomfort. This doesn't mean ignoring problems or pretending emotions don't exist. Stoics value self-awareness and self-discipline. They believe in examining your reactions, training your character, and making choices based on reason, not impulse. For example, if someone insults you, a Stoic approach wouldn't involve shouting back or stewing in anger. It would involve pausing, recognizing that the insult can't hurt your integrity, and choosing not to let it control you. Stoicism also encourages reflection through practices like journaling, meditation on mortality, and reminding yourself of your principles. Historical Stoics like Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus wrote practical advice, not abstract theory. Their goal was to build resilience and peace of mind in daily life, even under pressure. The philosophy gained renewed interest in recent years, especially among people seeking mental clarity, emotional balance, and strength in uncertain times. Stoicism offers a toolkit for living well, not by changing the world around you, but by strengthening the way you move through it. Epicureanism, the pursuit of pleasure. Epicureanism gives us a surprising approach to happiness. Epicureanism is a philosophy that began with the ancient Greek thinker Epicurus. Despite what the name might suggest, it's not about luxury or indulgence. In fact, it teaches that true happiness comes from simplicity, moderation, and peace of mind. At its heart, Epicureanism is about seeking pleasure, but not in the way most people imagine. Epicurus believed that pleasure is the highest good, but he made a clear distinction between short-term thrills and lasting satisfaction. He argued that the most reliable pleasures come from avoiding pain, reducing anxiety, and living wisely. This means choosing a life that's calm, thoughtful, and free from unnecessary stress or fear, especially fear of death or punishment from the gods. According to Epicureanism, many of the things people chase, status, wealth, power, often cause more worry than joy. Instead, Epicurus emphasized friendship, self-sufficiency, and reflection. He believed that once basic needs are met, happiness depends more on how we think than on what we have. He also introduced a practical idea called the tetrapharmakos, or four-part cure. Don't fear the gods, don't fear death. What is good is easy to get, and what is terrible is easy to endure. These principles weren't just theory, they were designed to help people feel less anxious and more content in everyday life. Epicureanism offers a surprisingly grounded path to happiness. It encourages people to strip away distractions and focus on what really brings lasting peace, comfort, friendship, and a mind free from fear, not through excess, but through understanding what truly matters and letting go of what doesn't. Hedonism, pleasure as the ultimate good. Hedonism centers on the pursuit of pleasure. Most people enjoy pleasure, good food, relaxing vacations, laughter with friends. Hedonism takes that everyday idea and turns it into a full-blown philosophy of life. At its core, hedonism is the belief that pleasure is the highest good and the primary goal of life. It argues that the best life is one filled with enjoyment and the absence of pain. Rather than chasing status or moral duty for its own sake, hedonism puts well-being and happiness at the center. There are different types of hedonism. Psychological hedonism is the idea that people naturally seek pleasure and avoid pain. It's just how humans are wired. Then there's ethical hedonism, which goes a step further. It says that we should pursue pleasure because it's the only thing that's truly valuable in itself. This doesn't mean living without limits. Some forms of hedonism, especially the kind promoted by thinkers like Epicurus, actually recommend moderation. Overindulging in short-term pleasures can lead to long-term discomfort, which defeats the whole purpose. So while a night of partying might feel good, a hedonist focused on lasting happiness might opt for balance, choosing the kinds of pleasures that bring peace, not chaos. More extreme forms, like Cyrenaic hedonism, embrace immediate gratification, valuing physical pleasures above all else. But these versions often face criticism for ignoring consequences and depth. Hedonism raises important questions about what really matters in life. Is pleasure enough? Does it lead to fulfillment? Or does it leave something out? Critics argue it can be shallow or selfish. Supporters say it's realistic, personal, and honest about what people actually want. As a philosophy, hedonism encourages a clear focus. Aim for joy, reduce suffering, and make choices that increase satisfaction both in the moment and over time. It invites a closer look at what pleasure really is and how it shapes the lives we build. Consequentialism, judging by results. Consequentialism judges actions by their outcomes. If holding the door for someone makes their day better and ignoring them makes it worse, then which choice is right? According to consequentialism, the answer lies in the outcome. Consequentialism is a family of ethical theories that judge actions based on their consequences. In other words, what makes an action right or wrong isn't the intention behind it or whether it follows a rule, it's the result it produces. The better the outcome, the more morally justified the action is. The most well-known form of consequentialism is utilitarianism, which focuses on maximizing overall happiness and minimizing suffering. For example, if a doctor can save 5 patients by using the organs of one healthy person, a strict utilitarian might argue that it's the right thing to do because it leads to more lives saved. Of course, this raises serious moral concerns, and that's part of what makes consequentialism so widely debated. There are other versions too. Some focus on promoting justice, freedom, or well-being rather than happiness alone. What they all share is the basic idea that the ends matter more than the means. Consequentialism appeals to many because it offers a practical way to think through ethical choices. It asks you to weigh the impact of your actions, not just whether they follow rules or feel right in the moment. But it also has challenges. It can be hard to predict all the consequences of an action, and sometimes it seems to allow morally troubling behavior if it leads to a greater good. Still, consequentialism remains one of the most influential approaches in ethics. It's used in public policy, medicine, and everyday decision-making, anywhere people need to weigh benefits and risks to decide what should be done. It turns morality into a matter of results and pushes us to think beyond intentions to the bigger picture. Utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. Utilitarianism gives us a mathematical-like approach to ethics. Imagine you're choosing between saving 1 person or saving 5. For utilitarianism, the answer is clear. Choose the option that helps the most people. Utilitarianism is an ethical theory that says the right thing to do is whatever brings about the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. It's a form of consequentialism, which means it focuses on outcomes, not intentions, rules, or traditions, just the results of our actions. The core idea is simple. If an action increases overall well-being, it's good. If it increases suffering, it's not. This principle can apply to individual decisions, like whether to lie to protect someone's feelings or to large-scale policies, such as how to distribute healthcare or respond to climate change. Utilitarianism gained major traction in the 18th and 19th centuries through thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Bentham emphasized pleasure and pain as the basis for morality, while Mill refined the theory to consider not just the quantity of happiness but also its quality. For example, he argued that the joy from reading a great book might be more valuable than the pleasure of eating a delicious snack. One of utilitarianism's strengths is that it offers a clear and flexible guide to decision-making. It doesn't rely on rigid rules. Instead, it asks us to look at each situation and ask what will do the most good. But it also has its critics. Some say it can justify morally questionable acts, like harming one person if it benefits many others. Others argue that it's hard to measure happiness or predict outcomes accurately. Even with these challenges, utilitarianism remains one of the most influential ethical frameworks. It encourages thoughtful, outcome-based reasoning and continues to shape debates in ethics, politics, and everyday moral decisions. Deontology, duty-based ethics. Deontology focuses on principles rather than outcomes. Telling the truth, keeping promises, and treating people with respect. These are things we often think we should do no matter the outcome. That's the foundation of deontology. Deontology is a theory in moral philosophy that focuses on duties and rules rather than results. The word itself comes from the Greek word for duty. At its core, deontology says that certain actions are morally right or wrong in themselves, regardless of what they lead to. It's not about maximizing happiness or minimizing harm. It's about doing the right thing because it's the right thing. One of the most well-known deontological thinkers was Immanuel Kant. He believed that moral actions are guided by principles that should apply universally. For example, if lying is wrong, then it's wrong in every case, even if a lie might protect someone or avoid conflict. The idea is that morality isn't about weighing outcomes, it's about acting from a sense of obligation grounded in reason. Deontology values consistency and respect for others. It treats people as ends in themselves, not as tools to achieve a result. That means you shouldn't harm someone, even if doing so could benefit a larger group. For a deontologist, following moral rules matters more than chasing the best possible outcome. This approach has both strengths and challenges. It offers a strong defense of human rights and justice, and it's easy to apply in everyday situations. Don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat. But it can also lead to tough dilemmas, especially when rules seem to conflict, or when following a rule causes real harm. Still, deontology has had a lasting impact on ethics, law, and human rights. It reminds us that how we act and why we act can be just as important as what we achieve in the end. Moral relativism ethics across cultures. Moral relativism challenges the idea of universal ethical standards. What's considered right in one culture might be seen as wrong in another. Eating with your hands, wearing certain clothes, or following specific traditions, these actions are judged differently depending on where you are. That's the basic idea behind moral relativism. Moral relativism is the view that there's no single universal standard for right and wrong. Instead, morality depends on cultural norms, personal beliefs, or historical context. What's ethical in one society might not be in another, and no single perspective has absolute authority over the rest. There are a few different forms of moral relativism. Cultural relativism focuses on societies, arguing that each culture defines its own moral code. According to this view, practices like arranged marriage, dietary laws, or even concepts of justice should be understood within their cultural framework, not judged by external standards. Then there's individual relativism, which holds that morality is shaped by personal beliefs. In this case, what's right for one person might not be right for someone else, and that's okay, because moral truth is not objective, it's subjective. Supporters of moral relativism argue that it promotes tolerance and understanding. It encourages people to question their assumptions and recognize that different cultures and individuals can have deeply held yet different values. But critics worry that if morality is entirely relative, it could excuse harmful behavior or make it hard to challenge injustice. After all, if no value system is better than another, how do we criticize cruelty or oppression? Still, moral relativism plays a key role in ethics and global dialogue. It highlights the complexity of human values and reminds us that moral systems aren't always one-size-fits-all. In a diverse world, understanding how and why people differ in their beliefs is essential to living together respectfully. Moral objectivism, universal ethical truths. Moral objectivism argues for universal moral principles. Stealing someone's property, harming innocent people, or breaking promises, these are actions most people agree are wrong, no matter where they live or what they believe. That's the foundation of moral objectivism. Moral objectivism is the view that some moral principles are universally true. According to this theory, certain actions are right or wrong independent of personal opinions, cultural norms, or historical context. It doesn't mean everyone always agrees or behaves perfectly. It means that right and wrong exist, whether people recognize them or not. This idea stands in contrast to moral relativism, which suggests that morality varies from one culture or person to another. Where relativism says moral truth is flexible, objectivism says it's stable. So while societies might disagree on minor issues, objectivists argue that there are core moral values, like fairness, justice, or honesty, that hold across time and place. There are different ways to ground these objective values. Some versions rely on reason, arguing that logical reflection reveals moral truths. Others connect morality to human well-being, claiming that certain actions are wrong because they cause harm or violate human dignity. Religious versions point to a divine source for moral law, though secular objectivists base their views in human nature or rational argument. One strength of moral objectivism is that it provides a foundation for criticizing injustice. If slavery or discrimination are objectively wrong, then it doesn't matter if they were accepted in the past or justified by a specific culture. They can still be condemned on moral grounds. Moral objectivism is a powerful framework for ethics. It insists that moral questions aren't just a matter of taste or tradition. They can have real answers, and those answers, according to this view, are true whether we agree with them or not. Natural rights, inherent human entitlements. Natural rights are the rights we are born with. You don't have to earn the right to speak your mind or to live your life freely. Those rights are yours by nature. That's the basic idea behind natural rights. Natural rights are moral principles that are considered to belong to all people simply because they are human. They're not granted by governments, and they don't depend on culture or laws. These rights are thought to exist universally and independently of any legal system, making them a cornerstone of many political and ethical theories. The concept became especially influential in the 17th and 18th centuries, with philosophers like John Locke arguing that all individuals are born with certain basic rights, specifically life, liberty, and property. According to Locke, the main role of government is to protect these rights, and any government that violates them loses its legitimacy. Natural rights often show up in founding political documents. The U.S. Declaration of Independence, for example, talks about rights that are unalienable, meaning they can't be taken away. These include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The idea is that these rights are built into human existence and should be respected everywhere, no matter who's in charge. Importantly, natural rights differ from legal rights. Legal rights are created by governments and can vary from country to country. Natural rights, by contrast, are thought to be constant. You don't get them because someone gave them to you. You have them because you're a person. This idea has had a major impact on modern human rights movements, constitutional law, and international agreements. It helps explain why certain freedoms are seen as fundamental and why violating them is treated as a serious injustice. Natural rights lay the groundwork for the idea that some things should never be up for negotiation because they belong to everyone by default. Anarchism, society without authority. Anarchism envisions a world without rulers. No rulers, no bosses, no government telling you what to do. That's the basic idea behind anarchism. But it's not just about chaos or rebellion. At its core, anarchism is a serious political philosophy with a clear message. People can organize their lives without being controlled by centralized authority. Anarchism challenges the idea that we need a state to have order, justice, or cooperation. It argues that power structures, especially those based on coercion, tend to concentrate authority in the hands of a few and often lead to exploitation, inequality, or oppression. Instead, anarchists believe society should be based on voluntary cooperation, mutual aid, and self-governance. There are different forms of anarchism, each with its own focus. Anarcho-communists envision a stateless, classless society where property is shared and decisions are made collectively. Individualist anarchists, on the other hand, emphasize personal autonomy and freedom from interference. Anarcho-syndicalists see labor unions as a key force in dismantling capitalist systems and organizing workplaces democratically. What they share is a deep skepticism toward authority. Anarchists don't believe all order is bad. They just think it should come from the bottom up, not the top down. For example, instead of a government-run police force, anarchists might advocate for community-based conflict resolution. Instead of hierarchical companies, they support worker-owned cooperatives where decisions are made collectively. Critics often argue that anarchism is unrealistic or utopian. Supporters counter that many anarchist principles already exist in everyday life, like neighbors helping each other, open-source software projects, or grassroots community organizations. Philosophically, anarchism isn't just about rejecting the state. It's about building alternative systems that value freedom, equality, and cooperation without depending on control. It's a vision of society where power is shared, not imposed, and where people live and work together on their own terms. Libertarianism, maximizing individual freedom. Libertarianism puts liberty at the center of political life. If you want to live your life without being told what to do, keep your money, make your choices, and stay out of other people's business, then you're already thinking like a libertarian. Libertarianism is a political philosophy that places individual freedom at the center of everything. It argues that people should have the maximum amount of liberty possible as long as they don't harm others. That means being free to speak, work, own property, and make personal decisions without interference from the government or anyone else. At the heart of libertarianism is a strong belief in personal responsibility and limited government. Libertarians argue that most government involvement, especially in the economy or in private life, tends to do more harm than good. They believe people are better at managing their own affairs than distant officials or bureaucracies. Economically, libertarianism supports free markets. That means minimal regulation, low taxes, and voluntary exchange. If two people agree on a deal, the government shouldn't get in the way, whether it's a small business or a big investment. In social matters, libertarians also support freedom. They might disagree with certain behaviors, but they don't think it's the government's job to control them. There are different kinds of libertarians. Some focus more on economic freedom, others on civil liberties. But they all share a core principle. Individuals should be free to live their lives as they choose, as long as they respect the same freedom for others. Philosophers like John Locke and modern thinkers like Robert Nozick have shaped libertarian ideas, arguing that each person owns their life, their labor, and the things they earn from it. In practice, libertarianism challenges both government overreach and corporate power, pushing for a society where freedom isn't granted by the state. It's assumed by default. Liberalism, liberty, and equality. Liberalism shaped modern democratic societies. You have the right to speak freely, to vote, to practice your beliefs, and to live the life you choose. Those ideas didn't come out of nowhere. They're rooted in the philosophy of liberalism. Liberalism is a political and moral philosophy built around the idea of individual freedom. At its core, it argues that every person should have the liberty to make their own choices, as long as those choices don't interfere with the rights of others. It supports equality under the law, democratic government, and the protection of civil rights. The origins of liberalism can be traced back to Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, who argued that all people have natural rights to life, liberty, and property. These ideas laid the groundwork for modern democracies, shaping constitutions and legal systems around the world. Liberalism values a balance between freedom and fairness. It says the government exists not to control people, but to protect their rights. That includes things like freedom of speech, religious tolerance, the right to a fair trial, and protection against arbitrary power. Over time, liberalism has evolved into different branches. Classical liberals emphasize limited government and free markets, believing individuals thrive best with minimal interference. Social liberals, on the other hand, support a more active role for government in reducing inequality and providing basic services like education and healthcare, aiming to ensure that freedom is meaningful for everyone, not just those who already have resources. Liberalism has shaped much of the modern world, influencing everything from civil liberties to international human rights. It promotes the idea that society works best when people are free to pursue their goals in a system that values consent, diversity, and the rule of law. It's not about one-size-fits-all answers. It's about building a framework where freedom and fairness can coexist. Marxism, class struggle and revolution. Marxism analyzes society through economic power. You wake up, go to work, put in your hours, and get paid while someone else, the owner, takes home most of the profit. That everyday situation is exactly what Marxism was designed to critique. Marxism is a political and philosophical theory developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the 19th century. At its heart, it's a way of understanding society through the lens of class struggle, specifically the ongoing conflict between those who own the means of production and those who sell their labor to survive. According to Marxism, society is divided into two main groups: the bourgeoisie, who control land, factories, and capital, and the proletariat, who work for wages. Marx argued that this setup is inherently exploitative. Workers produce value through their labor, but they only receive a fraction of that value in return. The rest becomes profit for the owners. Marx believed this imbalance leads to inequality, alienation, and social tension. Over time, he predicted these tensions would intensify until the working class rose up, overthrew the capitalist system, and replaced it with a classless society where the means of production are owned collectively. This end goal is known as communism, but Marxism also includes the transitional phase of socialism, where the state manages resources in the name of the workers. Importantly, Marxism is not just an economic theory. It also includes a critique of ideology, culture, and how dominant systems shape the way people think. In practice, Marxist ideas have influenced revolutions, governments, labor movements, and academic fields. While interpretations vary widely, and some real-world attempts have been deeply controversial, the core of Marxism remains focused on power, inequality, and the belief that economic structures shape almost every part of life. It's a framework meant to analyze not just how the world works, but how it might be transformed. Dialectical materialism, history through conflict. Dialectical materialism explains how societies change. History doesn't move in a straight line. It moves through conflict, struggle, and change. That's the basic idea behind dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism is a philosophical framework used by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels to understand how societies develop over time. It combines two major ideas: materialism, the view that the physical world, especially economics, shapes human life, and dialectics, the idea that progress happens through the clash of opposing forces. Let's break that down. Materialism says that the foundation of any society is its economic system, how people produce, trade, and survive. Everything else, laws, politics, culture, grows out of that base. If the economy changes, everything else eventually changes with it. Dialectics adds a second layer. It says that change doesn't happen gradually or peacefully. It happens through contradictions, tensions between different social forces. In Marxist theory, the central contradiction is between classes. For example, in capitalism, it's the tension between the working class who produce goods and the capitalist class who own the factories and keep the profits. As these contradictions build, they reach a breaking point. The system can't resolve its own problems and a new system emerges. This is how Marxists explain major historical shifts, like the fall of feudalism and the rise of capitalism, and eventually the possible transition from capitalism to socialism. Unlike older views of history that focus on great leaders or ideas, dialectical materialism focuses on material conditions and collective struggle. It's not about fate or accident. It's about the forces beneath the surface that drive change. This theory became the official philosophy of many Marxist governments, especially in the 20th century. It's a method for analyzing not just economics or politics, but how the world changes through contradiction, pressure, and ultimately transformation. Socialism, collective ownership. Socialism envisions an economic system based on shared resources. You work hard, contribute to society, and expect a fair return. But in many systems, a few people at the top take most of the reward. Socialism steps in with a different vision. Socialism is a political and economic philosophy built around the idea that the means of production, like factories, land, and resources, should be owned or controlled collectively rather than by individuals or private companies. Its central goal is to reduce inequality and ensure that wealth is distributed more fairly across society. At the heart of socialism is the belief that basic needs like healthcare, education, and housing should be accessible to everyone, not just those who can afford them. In practice, this often means a stronger role for the government in providing services and regulating the economy. Though there are many different versions of socialism that range from democratic models to more centralized, state-run systems. Unlike capitalism, where markets drive production and profit motivates business decisions, socialism emphasizes cooperation over competition. Decisions about how resources are used aim to benefit the whole community, not just shareholders or owners. For example, a public transit system funded by taxes and available to all fits within a socialist framework. It prioritizes access and utility over profit. There are also forms of socialism that emphasize local control, worker ownership, and participatory planning, where employees manage businesses directly and communities help shape economic priorities. These models argue that democracy shouldn't stop at the ballot box. It should extend to the workplace and the economy. Socialism has played a major role in shaping modern welfare states and labor rights. While debates continue about how much control should rest with the state versus individuals, the core idea remains that a fairer, more inclusive economy is possible when resources are shared and society is structured around collective well-being. Capitalism, markets, and private ownership. Capitalism is the dominant economic system in today's world. You buy your groceries, pay for streaming services, and maybe even sell something online. These everyday transactions are all part of a much larger system: capitalism. Capitalism is an economic and social system where private individuals or businesses own the means of production, things like land, factories, and tools, and operate them for profit. In capitalism, goods and services are produced and exchanged in markets where prices are largely determined by supply and demand. At its core, capitalism is built on a few key principles: private property, voluntary exchange, competition, and profit. You can own a business, hire workers, keep the profits, and reinvest to grow. The idea is that competition pushes companies to innovate, improve efficiency, and offer better products at lower prices. One major advantage of capitalism is its flexibility. Individuals are generally free to pursue their own economic goals, whether that's starting a business, choosing where to work, or deciding what to buy. Success is often measured by how well someone can meet market demand, and profit is the reward for doing so. But capitalism also raises big philosophical and ethical questions. Critics argue that when profit becomes the main goal, it can lead to inequality, exploitation, and environmental harm. For instance, workers might produce huge value but receive only a small portion of the profits, while business owners accumulate wealth. Supporters, however, point to capitalism's role in driving technological advancement, raising living standards, and expanding choice. There are different versions of capitalism around the world, some with strong government regulation and social safety nets, others more market-driven with minimal intervention. But the basic structure remains the same. Economic activity is largely in private hands, and prices guide decisions. As both a practical system and a philosophical idea, capitalism continues to shape how societies organize work, wealth, and opportunity on a global scale. Communitarianism, the common good. Communitarianism emphasizes our social nature and shared values. When people talk about rights, they often focus on the individual, your freedom, your choices, your voice. But communitarianism shifts the focus to something just as important: the community around you. Communitarianism is a political and social philosophy that emphasizes the importance of shared values, social responsibilities, and the common good. Instead of treating people as isolated individuals, it views them as deeply shaped by their relationships, cultures, and communities. The central idea is simple. A society isn't just a collection of individuals pursuing their own interests. It's a network of connections, families, neighborhoods, and traditions that give life meaning and structure. Communitarian thinkers argue that too much focus on individual rights can weaken these bonds and leave people feeling disconnected. While communitarianism doesn't reject personal freedom, it suggests that freedom works best when it's grounded in mutual responsibility. For example, free speech is important, but how we use it should consider the health of the community. The same goes for economic activity. You might have the right to run a business, but the choices you make as an employer or producer affect more than just your bottom line. In practical terms, communitarianism supports policies that strengthen civic life, like public education, community development, and local decision-making. It also encourages citizens to take active roles in shaping their surroundings, from volunteering to participating in public debates. Philosophers like Charles Taylor and Michael Sandel have used communitarian ideas to critique overly individualistic models of politics, especially those that ignore cultural and historical context. They argue that people don't exist in a vacuum, and understanding someone's values requires understanding the communities they're part of. Communitarianism challenges us to balance personal rights with collective responsibility, and to see freedom not just as independence, but as something built through connection and cooperation. Justice, fairness, and equality. Justice is one of the most fundamental values in human society. When someone gets what they deserve, whether it's a fair reward or rightful accountability, we often call it justice. But in philosophy, justice is much more than punishment or praise. It's a complex idea about how to create a fair and balanced society. Justice is the principle that everyone should be treated fairly, and that people should get what they are due, no more and no less. But figuring out what people deserve and what counts as fair has led to some of the most important debates in philosophy. There are several major ways of thinking about justice. One of the most influential is distributive justice, which focuses on how resources like wealth, education, and healthcare should be shared in a society. Should everyone get the same, or should people get more based on how hard they work or how much they need? Another approach is retributive justice, which deals with how wrongdoing should be punished. The idea here is that if someone breaks the rules, there should be consequences, but those consequences should be proportionate and based on fairness, not revenge. There's also procedural justice, which is about the fairness of processes, even if the outcome isn't equal. Were the rules clear? Was everyone treated the same way during decision-making? This is especially important in courts, governments, and workplaces. Philosophers like Plato, John Rawls, and Amartya Sen have all tried to define justice in different ways, some focusing on ideal societies, others on improving real-world systems. For Rawls, for instance, justice meant designing society as if no one knew where they'd be born, to ensure fairness from every possible position. At its core, justice is about how we treat each other, how we balance rights, responsibilities, and the needs of individuals within the bigger picture of a shared world. Distributive justice, sharing resources fairly. Distributive justice addresses how society should allocate resources. Two people work full-time jobs. One earns enough to live comfortably, the other barely scrapes by. That gap is where the idea of distributive justice steps in. Distributive justice is a branch of political philosophy that focuses on how resources like income, opportunities, healthcare, and education should be distributed in a society. It asks what counts as a fair share and what systems best support a just outcome. At its core, distributive justice is about fairness, but fairness can mean different things depending on the framework. One common view is equality, where everyone receives the same amount regardless of differences. Another is equity, where resources are distributed based on individual needs. A third approach, meritocracy, rewards people according to effort, contribution, or talent. Philosophers have developed theories around these ideas. John Rawls famously argued that inequalities are only justifiable if they benefit the least advantaged members of society. He proposed a thought experiment where people design a society without knowing their future position in it, rich or poor, healthy or sick. His goal was to build fairness from the ground up. On the other hand, libertarian thinkers like Robert Nozick believe justice isn't about equal outcomes but about voluntary exchanges. If someone acquires wealth legally and without coercion, it's just, no matter how uneven the results may be. Real-world debates about taxation, welfare, minimum wage, and public services are all influenced by these ideas. Should a wealthy country provide free healthcare? Should students from underprivileged backgrounds receive extra support in school? These aren't just policy questions, they're philosophical ones rooted in distributive justice. The concept invites people to think about what kind of society they want to live in, and what systems best ensure that benefits and burdens are shared in a way that's fair, reasonable, and sustainable. Retributive justice, punishment for wrongdoing. Retributive justice focuses on appropriate consequences for wrongful actions. Someone breaks a rule, and there's a consequence. That basic idea sits at the heart of retributive justice. Retributive justice is a theory of punishment based on the principle that those who commit wrongs deserve to be punished in proportion to the harm they've caused. It's not about revenge or deterrence. It's about restoring a moral balance when someone violates the rules of society. Retributive justice says they should be held accountable because justice demands it. In this view, punishment isn't just a tool to prevent future crimes, it's a response to the wrongdoing itself. The focus is on moral responsibility. If someone steals, cheats, or harms another person, they've done something unjust, and retributive justice aims to right the wrong by delivering a penalty that fits the crime. One of the key ideas here is proportionality. The punishment should match the severity of the offense. A small crime deserves a small penalty. A serious offense calls for a more serious consequence. This is meant to ensure fairness and avoid both excessive punishment and unfair leniency. Retributive justice also emphasizes the importance of legal procedure. For a punishment to be just, it has to be based on evidence, due process, and clear rules. The goal is to avoid arbitrary or biased decisions and to ensure that justice is delivered through a fair system. Critics of retributive justice argue that it doesn't do enough to address the root causes of crime or to rehabilitate offenders. Supporters counter that justice is about more than just fixing future behavior. It's about holding people morally accountable in the present. Philosophers, lawmakers, and judges continue to debate how retributive justice should be applied. But the core idea remains powerful. When someone breaks the rules, they should face consequences, not to send a message, but because justice itself requires it. Restorative justice healing harm. Restorative justice offers an alternative to punishment-focused approaches. When someone causes harm, the first instinct might be punishment. But what if the focus shifted from punishment to healing? That's the idea behind restorative justice. Restorative justice is a philosophy and approach to justice that centers on repairing the harm caused by wrongdoing. Instead of asking, what rule was broken and how should we punish it, it asks, who was hurt, what do they need, and how can that harm be made right? At the heart of restorative justice is dialogue. It brings together the person who caused harm, the person who was harmed, and sometimes the broader community. The goal is to acknowledge what happened, understand its impact, and agree on steps to repair the damage, whether that means a sincere apology, restitution, community service, or a plan for making better choices in the future. Unlike retributive justice, which emphasizes punishment as a moral response, restorative justice emphasizes accountability through understanding and action. It doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it encourages those responsible to actively participate in making amends. It also gives victims a voice in the process, allowing their needs and experiences to shape the outcome. Restorative justice is used in various settings, from schools to workplaces to criminal justice systems. For example, instead of suspending a student for fighting, a school might organize a facilitated meeting between the students involved, helping them understand each other and resolve the conflict. Philosophically, restorative justice is rooted in ideas of community, connection, and mutual responsibility. It sees crime not just as a violation of rules, but as a break in relationships, and it aims to rebuild those relationships through empathy, honesty, and effort. While it's not a replacement for every situation, restorative justice offers a powerful alternative, one that seeks to heal rather than just punish, and to rebuild rather than simply remove. Authority, the right to rule. Authority gives certain people the right to direct others' actions. Everyday people follow orders, whether it's a teacher assigning homework, a boss setting deadlines, or a government enforcing laws. But what gives these commands weight? That's the question behind the philosophical idea of authority. Authority is the recognized right to give orders, make decisions, or enforce rules. Unlike raw power, which is simply the ability to control others, authority implies legitimacy. When someone has authority, people believe they should be obeyed not just because they can punish, but because they hold a rightful position. Philosophers break authority into different types. Legal authority is tied to laws and institutions, like judges or police officers who enforce rules that society has agreed to. Traditional authority comes from long-standing customs, like monarchies or religious leaders. Charismatic authority is based on personal qualities, when someone inspires loyalty through confidence, vision, or charm. What makes authority philosophically interesting is that it raises questions about obedience and freedom. If someone has authority, does that mean others lose some autonomy? Thinkers like Thomas Hobbes argued that strong authority is necessary for social order. Without it, society might fall into chaos. Others, like John Locke, emphasized that legitimate authority must come from consent. People have to agree, at least indirectly, to the rules they follow. Modern democratic systems often balance authority with accountability. Elected officials, for example, have authority to make laws, but only as long as voters allow it. If authority is abused or disconnected from the people it governs, it risks becoming illegitimate and resistance becomes a moral question. In everyday life, Authority shapes our relationships, institutions, and social expectations, whether in schools, governments, or workplaces. It's what holds structures together, but it also depends on trust, fairness, and the belief that those in charge are acting in the right way. Legitimacy, the right to power. Legitimacy addresses why we accept authority. A police officer directs traffic, a judge gives a ruling, and a president signs a law. But what makes these actions more than just personal decisions? That's where the concept of legitimacy comes in. In philosophy and political theory, legitimacy refers to the rightfulness of authority or power. It's what makes a government, law, or institution not just powerful, but acceptable in the eyes of the people. It's the difference between being obeyed because you can punish and being obeyed because people believe you should be in charge. Legitimacy isn't about whether someone follows the rules. It's about whether the rules themselves are seen as valid. A government might have laws and enforcement, but without legitimacy, without the support and trust of its citizens, it often struggles to maintain order or influence behavior. There are different ways legitimacy can be established. Democratic legitimacy comes from elections and public participation. Leaders are chosen by the people, so their power is grounded in consent. Legal legitimacy is based on following established procedures, like courts interpreting laws through a consistent system. Moral legitimacy, on the other hand, depends on whether the system is seen as fair or just, even if it's not written into law. The concept is especially important in times of crisis or change. When people question the legitimacy of an institution, like a disputed election or an unjust law, its ability to function can break down. Protests, civil disobedience, or even revolutions often begin when legitimacy is lost. Philosophers like Max Weber and John Locke explored legitimacy as a foundation for stable government. Their work highlights how power alone isn't enough. It needs to be accepted, justified, and seen as serving the public good. In practice, legitimacy is what turns authority into something people are willing to follow, not just something they're forced to obey. Civil disobedience, principled resistance. Civil disobedience uses peaceful lawbreaking to challenge unjust laws. Not all lawbreaking is chaos. Sometimes it's a carefully planned act of protest. That's the essence of civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is the act of deliberately breaking a law to protest a rule, policy, or government decision seen as unjust. It's non-violent, public, and usually carried out with the full awareness that there may be legal consequences. The goal isn't to cause disruption for its own sake. It's to highlight injustice and push for change. This idea gained global attention through historical figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., who used civil disobedience to challenge colonialism and racial segregation. But the concept has deep philosophical roots. Thinkers like Henry David Thoreau argued that when laws violate moral principles, individuals have a duty not to comply. What sets civil disobedience apart from general lawbreaking is its moral grounding. The person disobeying isn't trying to benefit personally or escape responsibility. They're making a statement. For example, someone might refuse to pay taxes that fund a war or sit in a segregated restaurant to protest discriminatory laws. Philosophically, civil disobedience raises questions about the relationship between law and morality. If laws are made by legitimate governments, is it ever okay to break them? Supporters argue that legality doesn't always equal justice, and that sometimes breaking the law is the only way to expose and correct injustice. Critics, however, worry that civil disobedience undermines the rule of law. If everyone starts picking which laws to follow, the legal system could collapse. That's why those who practice civil disobedience often accept arrest or punishment. They're not rejecting law entirely, but appealing to a higher standard of justice. Civil disobedience plays a key role in democratic societies. It creates space for moral disagreement, holds institutions accountable, and reminds us that laws serve people, not the other way around. Utopia, imagining the perfect society. Utopia represents the human desire for an ideal world. Imagine a world with no poverty, no injustice, no conflict, a society where everything works perfectly. That's the basic idea behind utopia. In philosophy, a utopia is an imagined society that is considered ideal or perfect. The term was popularized by Thomas More in the 16th century, who wrote a fictional account of an island where social harmony, equality, and rational governance replaced greed and inequality. Interestingly, the word utopia comes from Greek roots meaning both no place and good place, hinting at the tension between dreaming of a better world and knowing it might never exist. Philosophers have used the concept of utopia not necessarily to build blueprints for real societies, but to explore what a just and harmonious world could look like. These thought experiments often reflect the values and problems of their time. For example, Plato's Republic outlines a society governed by philosopher kings, where reason rules over desire. In contrast, modern utopias might focus on technological progress, environmental sustainability, or radical equality. While utopias represent hope and possibility, they also raise philosophical challenges. Who decides what counts as a perfect society? Can perfection for one group mean oppression for another? These questions have led to dystopian responses in literature and philosophy, imagined societies where the attempt to achieve perfection ends in control, surveillance, or disaster. Still, the idea of utopia serves an important function. It pushes people to question the status quo and consider alternatives. It encourages reflection on justice, happiness, and human potential. Whether or not a true utopia can ever be built, the concept remains a powerful tool for thinking critically about how society is organized and how it might be better. Dystopia, when society goes wrong. Dystopia warns us about dangerous social trends. Imagine a future where every move is watched, every word is controlled, and freedom is a distant memory. That's the core of the philosophical concept of dystopia. A dystopia is an imagined society that appears organized on the surface, but is deeply flawed, oppressive, or terrifying underneath. Unlike a utopia, which aims to picture a perfect world, a dystopia explores what happens when power goes unchecked, systems break down, or ideals are taken to dangerous extremes. It's less about predicting the future and more about warning what could go wrong. Philosophically, dystopias ask what happens when basic human values like freedom, dignity, and truth are ignored or systematically undermined. These stories often feature highly controlled environments, rigid hierarchies, and the loss of individual rights. Governments may use surveillance, propaganda, or technology to keep citizens obedient. Sometimes the threat isn't the state, but corporate monopolies, environmental collapse, or social division. Famous examples include George Orwell's 1984, where thought itself is regulated, or Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, where control comes not through fear, but through pleasure and distraction. These fictional societies aren't just bleak. They're built to reflect real philosophical fears about human nature, political authority, and the cost of conformity. Dystopias also challenge ideas of progress. A society may seem advanced technologically or economically, but underneath, people may lack basic freedoms. Philosophers use dystopian thinking to test political theories, question moral assumptions, and highlight the risks of ignoring justice, empathy, or critical thought. While dystopias are fictional, they often reflect very real anxieties. They act as cautionary tales showing how good intentions or the desire for control, efficiency, or even happiness can spiral into dehumanizing systems. As a philosophical tool, the dystopian idea reminds us that how a society functions on paper isn't enough. It's how it treats people that really matters. Cosmopolitanism, global citizenship. Cosmopolitanism extends ethical concern beyond national borders. You may live in one country, speak one language, and follow one culture, but cosmopolitanism suggests you're also a citizen of the world. Cosmopolitanism is the philosophical idea that all human beings, regardless of their nationality, ethnicity, or background, belong to a single moral community. It's a view that values shared humanity over borders, arguing that people everywhere have equal worth and deserve equal consideration. The roots of cosmopolitanism go back to ancient Greece, where thinkers like Diogenes called themselves citizens of the world. But in modern times, it's been used to rethink global ethics, justice, and responsibility in a deeply interconnected world. At its core, cosmopolitanism challenges the idea that loyalty to one's own country or group should come before concern for others. For example, If people in one country are suffering from famine or conflict, cosmopolitan thinking says we shouldn't ignore them just because they're not our neighbors or fellow citizens. Their well-being matters too. This doesn't mean erasing cultural differences or pretending everyone is the same. In fact, many cosmopolitan thinkers argue that global citizenship should include respect for diversity. What unites people, according to this view, is the ability to reason, to empathize, and to live by shared values like justice and dignity. Cosmopolitanism also plays a big role in debates about international law, human rights, and global governance. Should wealthier countries do more to help poorer ones? Should climate change policies account for global fairness? These are cosmopolitan questions. Philosophers like Immanuel Kant and more recent thinkers such as Kwame Anthony Appiah have used cosmopolitanism to explore how people can live ethically in a globalized world, where actions in one place can affect lives halfway across the planet, and where belonging doesn't stop at the border. Aesthetics, the study of beauty and art. Aesthetics explores how we experience beauty and meaning in art. A painting on a wall, a song that gives you chills, a film scene that sticks with you. These aren't just entertainment. They're tied to one of philosophy's most intriguing branches, aesthetics. Aesthetics is the study of beauty, art, and taste. It asks why we find some things visually pleasing, emotionally moving, or artistically valuable. At its core, aesthetics tries to understand how we experience and judge what's beautiful or meaningful in creative expression. One of the big questions in aesthetics is whether beauty is objective or subjective. In simple terms, is something beautiful because it has certain qualities, or because someone happens to like it? Some philosophers argue that beauty follows universal rules, like symmetry or harmony, while others believe it depends entirely on personal or cultural preferences. Aesthetics doesn't just deal with fine art. It also explores everyday experiences, like why we enjoy sunsets, admire fashion, or care about how a room is decorated. Even design choices in technology or branding tie back to aesthetic principles. Another important area is the nature of art itself. What makes something art? Is it the creator's intention, the viewer's reaction, or the context in which it appears? A urinal in a museum might be art, while the same object in a restroom isn't. Aesthetics digs into why that shift matters. It also looks at how art communicates emotion, meaning, or political ideas. A protest mural, a tragic novel, or a minimalist sculpture can all provoke different reactions, and aesthetics helps unpack how and why that happens. Philosophers like Plato, Kant, and more recently Arthur Danto have all wrestled with the boundaries and value of art. Through aesthetics, we learn not just what we like, but how those preferences shape the way we think about culture, identity, and human experience. The sublime, beauty that overwhelms. The sublime describes those moments when we're moved by something greater than ourselves. Standing on the edge of a cliff, staring out at a thunderstorm rolling over the ocean, you might feel something that's not just beauty, but something bigger, more overwhelming. That feeling is what philosophers call the sublime. The sublime is a concept in aesthetics used to describe experiences that are vast, powerful, or even terrifying, yet still deeply moving or inspiring. Unlike ordinary beauty, which is often calming or pleasant, the sublime has a kind of intensity that pushes beyond comfort. It's not about perfection or balance. It's about encountering something so immense or profound that it shakes you a little. Philosophers started exploring the sublime in the 18th century. Edmund Burke described it as something linked to fear and grandeur, like mountains, storms, or deep space. Immanuel Kant added that the sublime is about the mind recognizing something bigger than itself, something it can't fully grasp but still tries to process. Importantly, the sublime isn't just about nature. It can show up in art, architecture, or even big ideas. A towering cathedral, a dystopian painting, or a story about the vastness of time can all trigger that same overwhelming mix of awe and unease. The experience of the sublime often creates a paradox. You feel small but not powerless. The scale of what you're seeing or thinking about might dwarf you, but it also connects you to something larger. It's not fear in the usual sense, it's fear mixed with wonder, distance, and curiosity. The sublime stretches how we think about aesthetics. It reminds us that not all beauty is soft or sweet. Some of it is wild, intense, and almost too much to handle. Philosophically, it opens up conversations about human limits, emotional depth, and the kinds of experiences that go beyond everyday understanding. Beauty, the nature of aesthetic appeal. Beauty has fascinated philosophers for thousands of years. You see a sunset, hear a melody, or look at a painting, and something just clicks. It feels right. It feels beautiful. But what is beauty exactly? Philosophically, beauty is one of the oldest and most debated ideas. It's a concept in aesthetics that deals with what we find visually or emotionally pleasing. But beauty isn't just about appearances, it's also tied to harmony, balance, and sometimes even meaning. The big question is whether beauty is something objective, out there in the world, or something completely subjective, based on personal taste. Some thinkers have argued that beauty follows certain rules. Things like symmetry, proportion, and clarity tend to show up again and again, from classical architecture to human faces. That's why we often find patterns in nature or design so appealing. There seems to be a structure we recognize, even if we can't always explain why. Others say beauty is purely in the eye of the beholder. What one culture sees as beautiful, another might not. A minimalist sculpture might feel cold to one person and elegant to another. And trends change. What's considered beautiful in fashion, music, or art evolves over time. But beauty isn't just visual. It can be emotional or intellectual. A powerful story, a scientific theory, or a well-crafted argument can all be described as beautiful. That's because beauty often connects to a feeling of coherence, when things fit together in a way that's satisfying or surprising. Philosophers from Plato to Kant have all tried to define beauty, but it resists being pinned down. It's both deeply personal and strangely universal. Whether it comes from nature, art, or ideas, beauty matters not because it's useful, but because it speaks to something we instinctively recognize as valuable, even when we can't fully explain it. Taste, personal aesthetic judgment. Taste refers to our personal judgment of beauty and aesthetics. Some people love abstract art, others can't stand it. One person's favorite movie is another's boring mess. These differences are often chalked up to something we casually call taste. In philosophy, taste refers to our personal judgment of beauty, art, and aesthetic value. It's about how we decide what we like and why. But it's more than just preference. Philosophers have explored whether taste can be developed, refined, or even evaluated as good or bad. Historically, the idea of taste became central during the 18th century, especially in European thought. Philosophers like David Hume and Immanuel Kant tried to figure out how people can disagree about art and beauty, yet still feel that some opinions carry more weight than others. On the surface, taste seems purely subjective. One person enjoys romantic comedies, another prefers documentaries. That's just how it is. But philosophical theories of taste dig deeper. Can we say one person has better taste than someone else? And if so, what does that mean? Hume suggested that good taste isn't about having the right opinion, but about having experience, sensitivity, and the ability to see details others might miss. A well-trained eye or a practiced ear can make more informed judgments, just like a skilled wine taster notices more than a casual drinker. Kant added another twist. He argued that when we say something is beautiful, we speak as if others should agree, even though we know they might not. That's because aesthetic taste carries a kind of universal claim, even though it's grounded in personal feeling. Philosophically, taste sits at the intersection of emotion, judgment, and culture. It helps explain how we navigate art, design, and even everyday choices. And while it's shaped by experience and background, it also reveals how deeply personal and shared our aesthetic lives can be. Artistic expression, communication through art. Artistic expression is how creators convey meaning through their work. A painting, a poem, a film, a dance, these aren't just things we look at or listen to. They're forms of artistic expression, and they tell us something deeper about what it means to be human. In philosophy, artistic expression is the idea that art is not just about creating objects. It's about conveying thoughts, feelings, or perspectives that might be difficult to express in ordinary language. When someone creates a piece of art, they're not just making something pretty or entertaining. They're communicating using color, sound, shape, or motion as their language. This concept goes beyond just self-expression. It's not only about how an artist feels, but also about how that feeling is translated into a form that others can connect with. A piece of music might express sadness, a sculpture might capture tension or calm, and a photograph might reflect a political moment. What matters is how the work channels something from the artist into a shared experience for the audience. Philosophers have explored how this process works. Some argue that artistic expression is about intent, what the artist wanted to say. Others focus on the result, what the audience perceives, even if that's different from what the artist had in mind. Either way, expression is key to how we understand and value art. Artistic expression also raises questions about creativity and authenticity. Is a machine-made painting expressive? What about art created under strict rules or commercial pressure? Philosophers use these questions to explore the boundaries of what counts as true expression. Ultimately, artistic expression connects the personal with the universal. It turns inner experience into something visible, audible, or tangible, something that invites others in. It's a bridge between individual perspective and shared meaning, and it's one of the most distinctive ways humans communicate who they are. Formalism. Art is pure form. Formalism focuses on the structural elements of art. A painting might not tell a story, represent a person, or make a political statement, but it can still be considered great art. That's the core of formalism. Formalism is a theory in aesthetics that says the value of art lies in its form, its visual or structural elements, rather than its content or context. According to formalist thinking, what makes a piece of art successful isn't what it represents, but how it's composed: line, color, shape, rhythm, texture. These are the building blocks that formalists focus on. In this view, a painting of a tree isn't judged by how realistically it shows the tree or what the tree might symbolize. It's judged by how the lines interact, how the colors balance, and how the overall structure holds together. The same goes for music, literature, or architecture. Formalists believe the aesthetic experience comes from engaging with these forms directly, not from thinking about deeper meanings or background stories. One of the most famous proponents of this idea was art critic Clive Bell, who argued that what makes art significant is its significant form, the arrangement of elements that provoke an aesthetic emotion. Similarly, in literary criticism, formalism looks at patterns, language, and structure in a text, rather than the author's intention or historical context. Critics of formalism argue that it strips art of its social and emotional layers. They say that ignoring content, history, or the artist's purpose can oversimplify what art is about. But formalists push back, claiming that sometimes meaning can distract from the pure aesthetic power of form itself. Formalism invites a different kind of attention, one that listens closely to the music of structure, observes the logic of design, and treats art as an object of focus rather than a message to decode. Expressionism. Emotion over accuracy. Expressionism prioritizes emotional impact over realistic representation. Art doesn't always aim to be pretty or balanced. Sometimes it's loud, distorted, or even unsettling, because its goal isn't to mirror the world, but to express what's happening inside the artist. That's the core idea behind Expressionism. Expressionism is a theory in art and aesthetics that puts emotional experience at the center of artistic creation. Instead of focusing on how accurately something is represented, expressionist art is judged by how effectively it communicates intense inner feelings: fear, anger, joy, anxiety, or confusion. Anxiety, or, in visual art, this often means exaggerated shapes, bold colors, and dramatic brushstrokes. A face might be twisted in a way that wouldn't make sense anatomically, but that distortion reflects a deeper psychological truth. In music, expressionism might take the form of dissonant harmonies or abrupt tempo changes. In literature, it could be fragmented narration or surreal imagery. The philosophical idea behind expressionism is that art is a direct channel for the artist's internal state. The goal isn't to depict reality as it is, but to project the artist's perception of it. This makes expressionist work highly personal and sometimes challenging. It doesn't ask viewers to understand a story or admire technique. It asks them to feel what the artist felt. Expressionism became especially prominent in early 20th century Europe during times of political and social upheaval. Artists used the style to respond to a world that felt chaotic or broken, but philosophically, the idea reaches further back and continues today. It appears wherever artists prioritize emotion over realism, mood over precision. Expressionism highlights a different kind of truth, one grounded in human feeling. It expands the idea of what art can be, shifting the focus from how well something imitates life to how deeply it resonates with the raw emotional core of being human. Mimesis art as imitation. Mimesis explores how art reflects reality. When you see a painting that looks just like a real landscape or read a novel that feels like watching real life unfold, you're experiencing something rooted in one of the oldest concepts in art philosophy, mimesis. Mimesis simply means imitation. It's the idea that art reflects, represents, or copies reality in some form. The concept dates back to ancient Greece, where philosophers like Plato and Aristotle used it to explain how art relates to the world around us. For Plato, mimesis was something to be cautious about. He believed art was just a copy of a copy. Reality, in his view, came from perfect abstract forms, and everything we see around us is already an imperfect version of that. So if art imitates those imperfect things, it's even further removed from the truth. To him, mimetic art could be misleading or emotionally distracting. Aristotle, on the other hand, took a more practical view. He saw mimesis not just as copying, but as a way to understand the world through imitation. Art can show us patterns in human behavior, explore emotions safely, or help us learn about life in a more engaging way. A tragedy on stage, for instance, may be fictional, but it captures real emotions like grief or fear in a way that feels meaningful. Over time, mimesis has evolved. In the Renaissance, artists aimed for hyperrealism, using perspective and detail to closely imitate nature. Later, modern art challenged the idea that imitation is the ultimate goal, shifting toward abstraction and expression. But even abstract or conceptual works often still relate to real experiences. They just represent them in less literal ways. Mimesis remains central to how we think about art's connection to reality. It's the foundation for questions like, what is art showing us? And how closely should it mirror the world we live in? Avant-garde. Breaking artistic boundaries. Avant-garde refers to artistic work that pushes boundaries and challenges conventions. You're at a gallery, and one of the paintings is just a blank canvas. Another features a pile of bricks on the floor. You might wonder, is this really art? Welcome to the world of the avant-garde. In philosophy and art theory, avant-garde refers to creative work that breaks away from traditional forms and pushes boundaries. The term comes from a French military expression meaning advance guard, the soldiers who go ahead of the main army. In the arts, avant-garde describes those who are ahead of their time, experimenting with new ideas, styles, and methods. Avant-garde art isn't just about being different for the sake of it. It's about challenging established norms, both in aesthetics and in society. That could mean rejecting realism in favor of abstraction, using unconventional materials, or turning art into political critique. Think of Dada's absurd collages during World War I, or conceptual pieces from the 1960s that questioned whether an object was even necessary for something to be called art. Philosophically, the avant-garde raises important questions about the role of art itself. Should art please the audience or provoke them? Should it reflect culture or try to change it? Avant-garde movements tend to reject the idea that art has to be beautiful or follow traditional rules. Instead, they explore what happens when art becomes disruptive, unpredictable, or even uncomfortable. Not everyone embraces the avant-garde. Some see it as pretentious or inaccessible. But historically, today's strange experiments often become tomorrow's mainstream. Impressionism, jazz, and even modern cinema all began as avant-garde movements before gaining widespread acceptance. At its core, the avant-garde isn't about having all the answers. It's about expanding the possibilities of what art can be. It asks us to consider how creativity evolves and how far it can go when it refuses to stay inside the lines. Institutional theory of art. Context makes art. The institutional theory of art explains how ordinary objects become art. A urinal placed in a museum might look like a plumbing fixture in any other context, but in the art world, it's considered a masterpiece. That's exactly the kind of puzzle the institutional theory of art tries to explain. This theory, popularized by philosopher George Dickey in the 20th century, offers a simple but bold idea. What makes something art isn't its appearance, originality, or emotional impact. It's whether the art world says it is. In other words, art is defined by the institutions that surround it: museums, critics, galleries, curators, and the broader cultural network that labels and validates works as art. Think about it this way. A painting by a child taped to a fridge isn't treated the same as a similar abstract work hung in a modern art museum. Even if they look alike, their meaning changes based on where they're placed and how they're received. The institutional theory says it's the context, not just the content, that matters. This doesn't mean anything can be art just by declaring it. According to the theory, there still needs to be recognition from the established art community. It's not just about an object. It's about that object being presented and accepted within an ongoing tradition of artistic practice. Critics of the theory argue that it gives too much power to elite institutions and sidelines the importance of intention or creativity. But supporters say it reflects how the art world actually works. It explains why unconventional works like Duchamp's fountain, a signed urinal, or Warhol's soup cans are taken seriously, not because they follow traditional rules, but because they've been given status through cultural recognition. The institutional theory shifts focus from what art is to how it functions within a system. It's a way of understanding art, not just as creation, but as participation in a shared cultural framework. Philosophy of life, finding meaning and purpose. Philosophy of life addresses the big picture of human existence. Everyone has a routine. Wake up, go to work, spend time with family, relax before bed. But underneath all of that is a bigger question. What's it all for? That's where the philosophy of life comes in. Philosophy of life is a broad, reflective approach to understanding the meaning, direction, and value of human existence. It's not a single theory or school of thought. Instead, it's an umbrella for exploring the big picture questions that shape how people live. What does it mean to live well? What makes life meaningful? How should one handle suffering, success, or mortality? Unlike specific branches of philosophy like ethics or metaphysics, philosophy of life blends many perspectives, drawing from ancient wisdom, personal reflection, and even practical experience. For example, Stoicism emphasizes endurance and rational control. Existentialism, on the other hand, focuses on individual choice and the struggle to find meaning in an indifferent universe. Other views might highlight service to others, pursuit of happiness, or alignment with nature. This kind of philosophy often overlaps with religion, psychology, and art. It's not just about theories, it's about the decisions people make every day. Choosing how to spend time, how to treat others, or how to deal with setbacks all involve assumptions about what life should be. Importantly, the philosophy of life isn't reserved for philosophers. Writers, scientists, activists, and everyday people all contribute to this ongoing conversation. It's flexible, personal, and constantly evolving. Rather than offering definitive answers, it encourages deeper engagement with existence itself. It helps frame not just how people think, but how they live, guiding values, shaping habits, and influencing what ultimately matters in the long run. As a philosophical idea, the philosophy of life invites reflection not through abstract puzzles, but through the real patterns and choices of daily experience. Meaning of life, the ultimate question. The meaning of life may be philosophy's most enduring question. Why do people chase careers, fall in love, raise families, or build legacies? At the heart of all these choices is one of philosophy's most enduring and universal questions. What is the meaning of life? The phrase meaning of life refers to the idea that life might have a deeper purpose, goal, or value beyond just existing day to day. It's a question that spans cultures, religions, and historical eras. Philosophers, theologians, scientists, and artists have all offered different answers, some grounded in logic, others in belief or intuition. In religious traditions, meaning often comes from a divine source. Life has purpose because it was created for a reason, whether to serve a higher power, reach enlightenment, or fulfill a sacred plan. In contrast, secular philosophies sometimes approach the question by asking what people can create for themselves. Existentialist thinkers like Sartre argued that life doesn't come with built-in meaning, but humans can give it meaning through their actions, relationships, and choices. Other approaches focus on contribution. Some suggest that life finds meaning in helping others, improving the world, or pursuing knowledge. Others emphasize enjoyment and fulfillment, living a good life by experiencing love, creativity, or personal growth. There's also the possibility that meaning isn't singular or fixed. It might shift throughout life, influenced by age, culture, or circumstance. What feels meaningful during childhood could look completely different in later years. Philosophically, the question challenges assumptions. It invites exploration into what really matters and why. But instead of offering one final answer, it opens the door to many possibilities, some external, some internal, all centered around what it means to live a life that feels worth living. The search for meaning isn't just academic, it's deeply personal, built into how people navigate their time, goals, and relationships. Optimism, believing in the good. Optimism is more than just a sunny outlook. It's a philosophical worldview. Some people look at a tough situation and still manage to say, "It'll all work out." That mindset, often dismissed as naive, is at the core of a powerful philosophical concept: optimism. In philosophy, optimism isn't just about having a sunny disposition. It's a worldview, the belief that the universe is, at its core, ordered in a way that tends toward good. This idea goes beyond feelings and into the structure of how people understand existence, morality, and progress. One of the most famous philosophical defenders of optimism was the 18th century thinker Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. He argued that out of all possible worlds, this one, the one we live in, is the best that could exist. In his view, even the bad parts of life serve a greater good, woven into a complex, ultimately harmonious system. But not everyone agreed. Thinkers like Voltaire pushed back, especially after disasters like earthquakes and wars. They questioned how anyone could say we live in the best possible world while witnessing so much suffering. This sparked a deeper discussion. Is optimism realistic, or does it ignore the harsh parts of life? Philosophical optimism doesn't claim life is perfect. Instead, it suggests that setbacks and pain can have purpose, or at least that progress is possible. Some versions argue that moral development, social improvement, or even personal growth are built into the nature of things. Others take a more abstract approach, seeing the universe as rationally structured toward balance or justice. Optimism as a philosophical stance shapes how people interpret events, respond to challenges, and define their sense of hope. It doesn't mean ignoring reality. It means believing that within reality, messy and unpredictable as it is, there's room for meaning, improvement, and possibility. In this view, optimism becomes more than attitude. It becomes a philosophy of how to live. Pessimism, acknowledging life's struggles. Pessimism offers a sobering counterpoint to optimistic philosophies. Sometimes, no matter how hard people try, things fall apart. Plans fail. Pain happens. And instead of insisting everything has a silver lining, some philosophers lean into a different view: pessimism. Philosophical pessimism isn't about being gloomy for the sake of it. It's a serious perspective that suggests life is fundamentally marked by struggle, dissatisfaction, or futility. While optimism sees progress and potential, pessimism highlights limits of happiness, reason, and human nature. One of the most well-known pessimists was Arthur Schopenhauer. He believed that human desire is a constant source of suffering. We always want something: comfort, love, success. And even when we get it, satisfaction fades and new cravings appear. From this angle, life is a cycle of striving and disappointment, with brief moments of relief. Others, like Friedrich Nietzsche, took a more complex view. He didn't deny life's hardships, but he explored how people could confront them with honesty and strength. Nietzsche's version of pessimism wasn't about giving up. It was about rejecting illusions and facing life head-on. Philosophical pessimism doesn't argue that nothing good ever happens. It simply pushes back on the idea that life is inherently good, or that things will naturally improve over time. Some pessimists question whether life has any built-in meaning at all. Others critique society's focus on productivity, success, or progress, arguing that these ideals often create more pressure than peace. This perspective has had a real impact on literature, art, and culture. It encourages reflection on vulnerability, mortality, and the limits of human control. Rather than offering comfort, pessimism offers clarity, a lens through which to examine the parts of life that are often ignored or glossed over. As a philosophical position, pessimism challenges people to think seriously about what can't be fixed and what it means to live meaningfully despite that. Epicurean view on death, freedom from fear. The Epicurean view on death provides a unique approach to our greatest fear. Death is one of the most universal experiences in life, but it's also one of the hardest to come to terms with. So what can philosophy tell us about it? The Epicurean view on death offers a perspective that might surprise you. Epicurus, an ancient Greek philosopher, argued that death isn't something we should fear. In fact, he believed that death is, in a way, irrelevant to us. Why? Because according to Epicurus, death is simply the end of conscious experience. When we die, we no longer exist to experience anything, not even pain or suffering. This might sound counterintuitive. Many people fear death because they imagine a kind of endless suffering or an unpleasant afterlife. But Epicurus challenged this idea. He proposed that since we can't experience anything once we're dead, death itself cannot be bad. What does it matter to me, he said, if I am not around to experience it? Epicurus also argued that many fears surrounding death come from the way we think about it while we're alive. We often worry about what comes after, creating unnecessary anxiety. But if we focus on enjoying the life we have, rather than worrying about an unknown future, we can live more peacefully. In practical terms, this philosophy encourages us to live for pleasure in a balanced way. By seeking simple pleasures like friendship, learning, or a good meal, Epicurus believed we can live happily without the burden of fear about what happens when life ends. The Epicurean view on death challenges conventional ideas about fear and afterlife. It reminds us that death is a natural part of life, and by embracing the present, we can free ourselves from the worry of what we cannot experience. Stoic view on death, acceptance of the inevitable. The Stoic view on death encourages us to face mortality with courage and acceptance. Death is inevitable, but how we face it can make all the difference. The Stoic view on death offers a powerful way to approach this natural part of life, one that doesn't dwell on fear or grief, but instead on acceptance and resilience. For the Stoics, a school of philosophy that began in ancient Greece, death is simply another part of nature's cycle. The philosopher Epictetus famously said, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." In other words, death is always around the corner, and it's crucial to live with the understanding that our time is limited. Stoicism teaches that we should not fear death because it is outside of our control. The key idea is that we can control how we react to life's challenges, but we cannot control when or how death comes. Accepting this fact, rather than resisting it, is where the Stoics find peace. They argue that fearing death is irrational because it's a natural part of life, just as much as birth, growth, and decay. The Stoics also encourage us to focus on living a virtuous life, making our time here meaningful by cultivating qualities like wisdom, courage, and self-discipline. If we live well, death becomes less of a threat. It's not the end of our story, but a transition we can accept calmly and without regret. By training ourselves to accept the certainty of death, the Stoics argue that we free ourselves from unnecessary anxiety. They remind us to live in the present, to cherish each moment, and to embrace death not as something to fear, but as a natural part of the journey. In this way, the Stoic view on death offers a deep sense of peace, one that comes from understanding our place in the world and accepting the inevitable. Immortality, the concept of endless existence. Immortality as a concept raises profound philosophical questions. The idea of immortality, living forever, is a concept that's captivated human imagination for centuries. Whether through myths, religion, or science fiction, the notion of an endless existence raises deep philosophical questions. What would it mean to live forever? And would we even want to? At its core, immortality refers to the idea that life could continue indefinitely without end. This concept can be split into two major forms: bodily immortality, where a person's physical body never ages or decays, and spiritual immortality, where the soul or consciousness survives after the body dies. In many religious traditions, immortality is closely tied to an afterlife. Christianity, for example, offers the belief that the soul lives on after death, either in heaven or hell. This kind of immortality is about continuing existence beyond our physical lives, and it's often framed as a reward or consequence for how we live on Earth. Philosophers, however, have debated whether immortality is even desirable. Some, like Epicurus, argued that death should not be feared because it is simply the end of conscious experience. If we don't exist, we don't suffer. In this view, immortality might not be something to chase because living forever could eventually become a burden, stripping life of its meaning. On the other hand, philosophers like Plato and Descartes thought that immortality of the soul or mind could be a perfect way to experience eternal truth or wisdom, free from the constraints of the physical world. The modern debate has shifted into more scientific and technological realms, with ideas about extending life through medicine or even uploading consciousness to machines. But the core question remains: is immortality a gift, or does it take something essential away from the human experience? Immortality challenges us to consider the value of life and death and how the knowledge of our limited time shapes how we live. Existential crisis, confronting life's big questions. Existential crisis describes moments when we deeply question our place in existence. We've all had those moments, times when you stop and wonder, what's the point of all this? That feeling, a deep questioning of life's meaning, is what philosophers call an existential crisis. An existential crisis is a period of deep reflection that challenges a person's sense of purpose, identity, or place in the world. It often arises when someone faces major life changes, such as a personal loss, an unexpected event, or simply the realization that life isn't as straightforward as it once seemed. In these moments, everything, relationships, achievements, even the simple act of living can feel uncertain. The roots of an existential crisis can be traced back to thinkers like Søren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche, who explored how individuals grapple with freedom, responsibility, and the search for meaning in a world that sometimes feels indifferent or chaotic. According to these philosophers, the struggle comes from confronting the inherent meaninglessness of existence. When people realize that life doesn't come with an inherent purpose or guarantee of happiness, they often feel a sense of dread, confusion, or despair. However, an existential crisis doesn't have to be a negative experience. While it may involve feelings of anxiety or hopelessness, it can also lead to growth and self-discovery. For some, it's an opportunity to break free from societal expectations and create their own meaning. Think of it as a wake-up call to live more authentically, embracing the freedom to make choices that align with your true values. An existential crisis highlights an essential truth: life is unpredictable, and finding meaning is a personal journey. It's a reminder that our search for purpose is what makes the experience of life so uniquely our own. Eternal recurrence, living each moment forever. Eternal recurrence asks us to consider how we would live if every moment repeated forever. Imagine living your life over and over again exactly as you've lived it. Every joy, every mistake, every heartache, every triumph. This is the concept behind eternal recurrence, a powerful and mind-bending idea introduced by the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. At its core, eternal recurrence is the idea that the universe and all of life's events repeat themselves infinitely in exactly the same way. Everything, our choices, our actions, and our experiences, comes around again, time after time, forever. It's not just that life repeats in a general sense, but with perfect exactitude, as though every moment you live is on a loop that never ends. Nietzsche proposed this concept not as a literal fact, but as a thought experiment. He asked, if you knew that your life would repeat eternally, would you live differently? Would you embrace each moment more fully, knowing it could come around again forever? Or would you feel trapped by the weight of endless repetition? The challenge of eternal recurrence is meant to provoke reflection on how we live and how we value each decision. The idea also connects with Nietzsche's philosophy of the Übermensch, the overman or ideal human being, who lives boldly and embraces life's challenges, including its struggles, with such vigor that they would willingly relive their existence forever. Eternal Recurrence asks whether we can live in a way that makes every moment meaningful, whether life's ups and downs are something to be embraced, not feared. It ultimately serves as a reminder of the significance of our choices. It pushes us to consider what kind of life we would live if we truly knew it would never end. Would we regret certain actions or embrace them? Would we seize every moment, knowing it's not just fleeting but eternal? Amor Fati, loving your fate. Amor Fati offers a philosophy of radical acceptance. Life is full of surprises, some good, some bad. But what if instead of resisting or resenting the difficult moments, we embrace them fully? This is the essence of Amor Fati, a concept introduced by the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Amor Fati translates to love of fate, and it means more than simply accepting what happens in life. It's about loving every part of life, including the suffering, mistakes, and hardships. Nietzsche believed that to truly live, we must not only accept the inevitable twists and turns of life, but actually affirm them as if we chose them ourselves. This idea challenges the common desire to avoid pain and seek comfort. Instead of seeing adversity as something to overcome or escape, Amor Fati encourages us to embrace it as an essential part of our journey. Imagine facing a setback at work or experiencing a personal challenge not with frustration or bitterness, but with acceptance and even gratitude. Nietzsche argued that by embracing every moment, both good and bad, we can live more fully and authentically. The concept also ties into Nietzsche's broader philosophy of becoming one's true self. He believed that through struggle and adversity, we grow stronger and more resilient. Amor Fati suggests that even our mistakes and suffering shape us, and that we should cherish them as necessary parts of our personal development. In a world that often pushes us to avoid discomfort, Amor Fati asks us to shift our perspective. It's not about blind optimism or pretending everything is perfect. It's about finding meaning and power in everything that happens and choosing to love our fate, whatever it may be. This mindset invites us to live not just passively but actively, with full engagement and acceptance of our own unique journey.